He was born in a time of shattering borders and shifting loyalties, when empires rose and receded like tides along the Mediterranean and beyond. The boy who would become known to the world as Saladin began life far from the palaces that would one day claim him, in the region of Tikrit where the rivers braided and the desert pressed close. His family belonged to the Kurdish military aristocracy, and from an early age he learned that honor and survival were taught as lessons by both sword and discipline. He grew up where loyalty could change overnight and survival meant strength. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what moves you more, his courage to fight or his discipline to endure. His given name was Yusuf, and the name Saladin, a title that would come to mean righteousness of the faith, was a later crown of reputation rather than a birthright. Even as a child he watched men who called themselves knights and emirs move like pieces on a broad chessboard, each calculated step measured not only in land but in alliances. The rhythms of the caravan, the cadence of prayers, and the smell of the forge were the background to his formation. They molded a temperament that respected both piety and the practicalities of governance. Tikrit was more than a place on a map. It was a crossroad where cultures, languages, and ambitions collided and combined. Young Yusuf absorbed stories of heroes and scholars, and he went into battlefields of conversation first, learning the histories and genealogies that would help him understand both friend and foe. He learned Arabic fluently and the arts of administration, but he never forgot his Kurdish roots, which gave him a particular sense of identity and a network of loyalties. From Tikrit he moved toward the centers of power, and his early career was shaped by two towering figures, Imad ad-Din Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din. These men sought to reclaim and consolidate lands held by fragmented Muslim authorities in the face of the Crusader states that had appeared along the Levantine coast. Yusuf's service under their banners honed his military skills and introduced him to the art of navigating the complex web of competing interests in the region. Zengi's campaigns taught Yusuf the importance of swift, decisive action, and Nur ad-Din's reign emphasized religious legitimacy as the binding force behind political authority. Under their influence, Yusuf was exposed to the idea that reconquest would require more than brute force. It would require legitimacy, coalition building, and moral leadership. He watched how Nur ad-Din used religious institutions and scholars to strengthen rule, a lesson he would recall when he himself needed to govern diverse populations with different faiths and customs. Two aspects of his character that became clear early were his patience and his sense of timing. He observed when to strike and when to hold back, learning that a great leader can win by refusing to fight as often as by waging war. This balance of restraint and aggression would be crucial when the time came to face the Crusaders, whose own strategic mistakes and overreach created openings Saladin would exploit. His path led him south to Egypt, a land that lay at the intersection of commerce, religion, and the politics of the day. Egypt was in a state of flux, its Fatimid Caliphate weakened by internal strife and foreign influence, and its position along trade routes made it a prize worth more than mere territory. For the ambitious and astute Yusuf, Egypt offered a chance to create a base from which to launch broader campaigns and to secure the resources necessary to challenge the Crusader presence in the Levant. Egypt itself was a lesson in governance. To rule it required talent beyond martial prowess. It required administrative sophistication, knowledge of finance, and an ability to negotiate with merchants, bureaucrats, and religious authorities. Yusuf arrived as a commander but soon proved himself as an administrator, preserving the structures that kept the granaries full and the canals flowing. His reforms were pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, but always with an eye toward long-term stability. As he grew in power, Yusuf embraced the religious mantle that Nur ad-Din had shown him, carefully aligning his actions with the language and authority of Sunni Islam while governing populations that included Christians, Jews, and Shia Muslims. This was not merely piety for piety's sake. It was a political strategy that conferred legitimacy across the region's diverse constituencies. The way he balanced religious rhetoric with practical tolerance became one of the hallmarks of his leadership. From Egypt, he turned his attention back to Syria and the fragmented territories that lay between him and Jerusalem. The Crusader states, small by geography but fortified by European manpower, naval supply lines, and internal cohesion, were a stubborn obstacle. Saladin understood that victory would require unification of the Muslim polities, and he set about building an alliance of loyalty through marriages, strategic appointments, and careful absorption of rival leaders into his cause. His methods were both patient and relentless. He offered amnesty and positions to former enemies when it suited him, and he crushed rebellion with a decisiveness that stopped dissent before it could become contagious. This duality made him unpredictable to his enemies and reliable to those who stayed. They came to see that his promises could be trusted and his punishments unavoidable. The consolidation of Syria under his banner was neither sudden nor easy, yet by the time the pieces fell into place, he had fashioned a state apparatus capable of sustaining long campaigns. Central to his rise was a reputation for personal austerity and a simple lifestyle that contrasted with the extravagance of some rivals. He ate plainly, traveled with a modest retinue, and made visible displays of piety that resonated with the masses. Yet he was also a man who understood the trappings of power, coinage bearing his name, the restoration of mosques, and patronage of scholars and jurists gave his rule an air of permanence. Military innovations and tactical acumen were equally important. Saladin favored mobility and intelligence gathering, employing light cavalry to harass supply lines and using fortified centers as hubs rather than static objectives. He placed great value on logistics, food, fodder, and the ability to move men and horses across harsh terrain, knowing that armies starved before they surrendered. His commanders learned to read the land and the seasons, and his campaigns often unfolded with an economy of movement that confounded slower, more cumbersome opponents. One of the defining episodes of his life was the campaign that culminated in the Battle of Hattin in 1187, a confrontation that reshaped the map of the Levant. The Crusader army, drawn out from its fortified enclaves, was caught away from water and forced into a desperate engagement that ended in catastrophic defeat. Saladin's encirclement of the Crusader forces, his patience in denying them supplies, and the psychological pressure he applied turned a military contest into a demoralizing collapse for the enemy. The fall of Hattin was followed by a cascade of surrenders and reconquests, many of them accomplished without the savagery that might have been expected. Saladin was careful in victory. He offered clemency to towns and to captured soldiers, often allowing life and property to continue in exchange for loyalty and tribute. This approach was strategic. He preferred to incorporate populations into a functioning order rather than ruin the very territories whose wealth he needed to sustain his rule. Jerusalem, however, occupied a different kind of place in the story. For Christians, it was a sacred city stripped away and held by foreign powers. For Muslims, it was sanctified by history and faith. Saladin's march toward Jerusalem had both political and spiritual dimensions, and when the city fell, the treatment of its inhabitants became a subject of intense interest and debate across continents. When Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin, the terms were negotiated with care. Instead of wholesale slaughter, many of the Christian inhabitants were allowed to leave upon payment of ransom, others were integrated into the new order. European chroniclers, for all their bias, still recorded the event with a mix of horror and grudging respect, noting that the city's churches were largely preserved and that wholesale devastation had been avoided. This restraint, choosing ransom over massacre, told much about Saladin's priorities. He sought the consolidation of power and the creation of a polity that could stand against further Western incursions. Turning refugees into enemies by merciless slaughter would have undermined his long-term position. Instead, he cultivated an image that appealed to both Muslims who desired righteous conduct and to foreign observers who were capable of recognizing magnanimity. His dealings with Christian leaders, and with the later arrival of the Third Crusade under figures like Richard the Lionheart, showcased his skill at both warfare and diplomacy. The face-off with Richard has become the stuff of legend, two formidable leaders who engaged in battles of arms but also in gestures of respect. When they met indirectly during campaigns and exchanged gifts and letters, the world watched as the lines between foe and courtly adversary blurred into something resembling a grudging mutual recognition. Richard and Saladin never reached a full negotiated peace, but they found ways to coexist and to respect certain conduits of humane action. Truces were struck, arrangements were made for pilgrimage, and even the transfer of prisoners sometimes took the form of courteous exchange. These moments of courtesy did not erase the violence, but they produced an image of Saladin that would be cherished and examined in both Eastern and Western narratives for centuries. Stories of his chivalry traveled fast, and in Europe he was recast in chronicles as an almost mythic figure of honor even while he was an adversary. This paradox, being both the enemy and an exemplar of knightly virtue, helped cement his legend in unexpected ways. Medieval poets and later historians found in his restraint a mirror to the ideals they ascribed to their own champions, and so Saladin became a figure of admiration across cultural lines. Back home, his rule required constant attention to the everyday mechanics of state. He maintained road safety for pilgrims and merchants, repaired irrigation systems, and kept bureaucrats in line. He relied on local notables for governance while asserting central authority where necessary, balancing autonomy with oversight in a way that fostered stability rather than rebellion. His military orders were mirrored by administrative reforms. He standardized army pay to prevent mutiny, entrusted provinces to loyal commanders, and used marriages and appointments to bind factions to his dynasty. These measures were neither romantic nor idealistic. They were calculations that bore fruit in times of scarcity and crisis, when the cohesion of his realm would be tested. Saladin also paid attention to culture and scholarship, aware that patronage extended his legacy beyond the battlefield. He rebuilt madrasas, supported jurists and theologians of Sunni Islam, and ensured that his image was linked to learning and piety. Scholars wrote in praise, poets composed verses that circulated in courts and caravanserais, and the memory of his deeds was recorded in chronicles that would survive his passing. Religion, in his hands, became both inspiration and instrument. He mobilized the language of jihad in a way that unified disparate groups under a common cause, while simultaneously tempering that rhetoric to avoid alienating minorities who were essential to the economy and social fabric. His approach to religious governance reflected a sophisticated understanding that force alone could not cement rule in a region as diverse as the Levant and Egypt. He was also a man of contradictions. Accounts from contemporaries describe a pious ascetic who slept little and prayed often, yet he could be ruthless in policy and severe with those who betrayed his trust. This blend of asceticism and severity gave him moral authority, but not unconditional loyalty. He was respected, sometimes feared, and always carefully watched by allies and opponents alike. Stories of his personal life tell of modest tastes and of a household that eschewed extravagant living. Though he could command armies and summon wealth, he was said to dine simply and to share the hardships of his soldiers. Observers noted that he would visit the sick, give alms, and maintain a presence among the people that bolstered his image as a ruler connected to the common welfare. Yet his household was also a seat of calculated power. Wives and relatives were married off to cement alliances, gifts were dispensed to curry favor, and ceremonial displays were orchestrated to reinforce hierarchy. These were the less romantic, more pragmatic instruments of statecraft that allowed him to translate battlefield success into durable governance. The formation of the Ayyubid dynasty, named after his father Ayyub, was the institutionalization of his power. He placed kin in key positions while retaining ultimate authority, ensuring that loyalty was bound by both blood and political necessity. The dynasty did not become a monolith overnight, and it required careful attention to rival claims, economic pressures, and external threats, but it provided a framework that lasted beyond his lifetime. His coinage and inscriptions were among the ways he communicated legitimacy. By placing his name and titles on money and public buildings, he asserted sovereignty in plain, daily transactions. Such gestures told people who ruled them not through speeches alone but through the material culture of everyday life, and they helped anchor a new political order across disparate provinces. Saladin's relations with other Muslim rulers were complex, as alliances were often as fragile as they were essential. He negotiated, sometimes offered generous terms, and at other times resorted to force to bring wayward emirs into line. His success in unifying much of Syria, Egypt, and parts of Iraq was not his alone. It was the outcome of a series of pragmatic choices that balanced conquest with conciliation. In military culture, his greatest legacy was perhaps the way he reimagined command and control. He integrated disparate forces, coordinated naval and land operations when necessary, and emphasized the need for intelligence and spies. He also cultivated commanders who could think independently, entrusting them with missions that required judgment rather than rote obedience. His enemies, for their part, were not static caricatures. The Crusader states evolved, recruited new warriors from Europe, and adopted their own forms of diplomacy. European monarchs came and went, and the papacy shifted strategies as well. Saladin had to adapt to a constantly changing set of opponents with varying resources and motivations. His ability to remain flexible, to experiment with tactics, and to learn from mistakes kept him a step ahead for many years. One persistent theme in accounts of Saladin is the role of charisma. He possessed a presence that inspired loyalty, whether among troops on the march or administrators in distant provinces. This charisma was not merely personal charm, it was conveyed through ritual, public piety, and demonstrable competence that gave people reason to follow his lead. At the same time, he was steeped in the politics of patronage. Scholars, jurists, and Sufi leaders received support that bound constituencies to his rule, and these networks of influence helped legitimize decisions that might otherwise have appeared merely opportunistic. Religion and scholarship offered a moral apparatus that made his political choices seem righteous and inevitable. His military victories were punctuated by less successful endeavors, reminding us that even the greatest leaders were not infallible. Campaigns stalled for lack of supplies, sieges bogged down, and occasional rebellions flared up in provinces where loyalty was thin. For every triumph, there were months or years of steady management to turn battlefield gains into lasting administration. Still, his contemporaries and immediate successors built on the foundations he laid. His sons and relatives inherited territories, and the Ayyubid presence extended across a wide swathe of the Middle East. The dynasty would face challenges in the years after his death, but the structures Saladin fashioned, military, administrative, and religious, shaped the region for generations. Beyond politics and war, Saladin became the subject of legend, folklore, and literary imagination. In the centuries after his death, minstrels, poets, and chroniclers embellished his life, turning events into emblematic tales of virtue and vice. These narratives often smoothed contradictions, emphasizing episodes of mercy or brave conduct that resonated with audiences seeking moral exemplars. Western literature, too, took him up as a figure of fascination. From troubadours to later historians, Saladin's reputation as a chivalrous adversary made him an attractive foil to European notions of knighthood. Over time, this admiration became part of a larger mythic exchange between cultures, where the enemy could also be an exemplar, and where virtues were recognized across battle lines. Artistic representations further shaped how people remembered him. Paintings, plays, and, in modern times, films and novels have interpreted Saladin in many ways, from noble warrior to ruthless politician, each portrayal revealing more about the era that produced it than about the man himself. These shifting depictions kept his memory alive, even as they recast him to fit contemporary needs and ideals. Saladin's death was the end of an era, but not the end of an influence. When he passed, his followers mourned a man who had woven together disparate regions into a single fabric of rule. Yet the threads he tied could fray, and in the years that followed, the Ayyubid lands would experience fragmentation and the rise of new powers both within and beyond the Muslim world. His burial and the rituals that followed were marked by a solemn recognition of his stature. Chroniclers recorded the grief of his contemporaries, the sermons in mosques, and the delegations that came to pay respects. In death, as in life, he became a symbol of unity and strength, a leader whose presence had altered the shape of the region he had governed. Over the long sweep of history, historians have debated and reevaluated his motives and methods. Some portray him as a devout holy warrior, others as a talented statesman who used religion as a tool, and many acknowledge both impulses at work. Primary sources, including Muslim chroniclers and European observers, provide a mosaic of perspectives that resist a single, tidy explanation. Modern scholarship has broadened the lens, examining economic factors, social networks, and environmental constraints that shaped his campaigns. Historians study coinage, taxation records, and the physical infrastructure he maintained to understand how his control was sustained. These investigations show that his power rested not only on swords but on a web of administration and commerce that kept his realm functioning. Yet for the public imagination, Saladin remains first and foremost a symbol of an age when faith, honor, and martial skill intersected. His life illustrates how human beings navigate the tension between the sacred and the secular, between mercy and necessity. In that sense, his story is enduring because it reflects the perennial dilemmas of leadership. He is also a reminder that history prizes complexity over caricature. A man who could be magnanimous could also be stern, and the same leader who spared a city's civilians could order harsh retribution against traitors. Recognizing this complexity helps us move beyond simple hagiography or condemnation, and toward an appreciation of the difficult choices leaders must make. His presence in the collective memory of the Middle East serves as a touchstone for discussions of sovereignty, resistance, and dignity. Leaders, activists, and scholars have invoked his name at different moments to legitimate political claims or to recall a golden age of unified rule. Such invocations show how historical figures become tools for contemporary narratives, reflecting current anxieties and aspirations. At the same time, his story highlights the limits of single-person narratives in history. Structures matter, geography, economy, and the shifting alliances of neighboring powers played as much of a role as Saladin's personal qualities. He was a catalyst and an actor within a larger stage, and his life teaches us how individuals operate within and against structural forces. Saladin's contemporaries recorded small, human gestures that reveal much about his character: a kind word to a grieving family, the distribution of alms in times of famine, the private letters he wrote to trusted colleagues. These moments humanize a figure often made into a symbol, reminding listeners that behind the grand campaigns lay a man who experienced doubt, fatigue, and the responsibilities of leadership. The military technology of his era also shaped outcomes. The use of catapults and siege tactics, the logistics of feeding an army, and the role of fortified cities all determined how campaigns unfolded. Saladin's appreciation for these practical matters, maintaining arsenals, securing supply lines, and timing sieges, made him an effective commander who understood war as an integrated art of material and moral factors. Pilgrimage and piety were threaded through public life during his rule. He ensured that roads were safe for pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem and other holy sites, and these protections had both spiritual and economic implications. Maintaining pilgrimage routes helped stabilize trade and reinforce the moral authority of his regime, connecting devotional life with material governance. His treatment of minorities is a subject that scholars continue to scrutinize with nuance. While he aligned himself with Sunni orthodoxy and reversed some of the policies of his Shia predecessors, he also recognized the practical need to live alongside Christian and Jewish populations. In many cases, his governance allowed for a measure of religious plurality that kept commerce and daily life functional. Saladin's family dynamics deserve attention as well. He entrusted relatives with far-flung provinces, and the loyalties within his extended household were as important as those he formed through formal institutions. These bonds were double-edged. They created unity and cohesion, but also planted the seeds of rivalry that would surface after his death. His contemporaries observed that he bore the burdens of command with a certain stoicism. Chroniclers tell of long nights of deliberation, councils that stretched into dawn, and the physical toll of campaigns on a man who aged visibly in the course of his struggles. These details make his achievements feel less like the product of myth and more like the outcome of relentless labor. Saladin's diplomatic skill is as worth studying as his military prowess. He negotiated truces, exchanged envoys, and sometimes accepted temporary compromises to buy time and resources. His letters and envoys crossed cultural and linguistic borders, and the subtleties of these communications reveal a leader adept at reading not only the map but the psychology of opponents. The material culture of his time helps us imagine the world he inhabited: richly woven carpets, the clatter of horses, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, and the murmured prayers in crowded mosques. Trade routes carried spices, scholars, and news, connecting regions from North Africa to Central Asia in networks that Saladin knew how to exploit. His rule was embedded in this lively, restless world where ideas and goods circulated and reshaped societies. A study of the administrative documents from his reign shows a ruler attentive to detail. Revenues were monitored, munition supplies catalogued, and the chain of command clarified through written orders. This bureaucratic layer is often overshadowed by battlefield narratives, yet it was essential to his enduring impact. Without functioning administration, victories remain ephemeral. His interactions with religious scholars also mattered. He sought their counsel and used their endorsement to strengthen his claims, but he rarely allowed scholarship to dominate policy when security demanded otherwise. This balance between deference to learned men and the exercise of executive power was key to maintaining both piety and pragmatism in governance. Saladin's ability to mobilize resources across provinces was a testament to his organizational skill. He coordinated taxation, requisitioned supplies for military campaigns, and managed the logistics of feeding large armies during long marches. These mundane but critical aspects of rule often determine the fate of campaigns, and his attention to them paid dividends when confronting the fortified but supply-dependent Crusader states. In the years following his death, memory and myth intertwined. Successors adopted parts of his administrative system, and poets memorialized his deeds in ways that blurred fact and romance. The Ayyubid imprint on architecture, law, and religious institutions carried forward his legacy, even as the political map continued to be redrawn by the pressures of new dynasties and invading forces. His image in later centuries took on new meanings. For nationalists and reformers in modern times, Saladin could be a symbol of unity and dignity. For writers of historical romance, he became a paragon of noble conduct. For scholars, a complex subject of study who defied easy categorization. Each retelling refashions him in light of present needs, proving the resilience of powerful historical images. Travelers' accounts from the medieval period add texture to the portrait. Pilgrims, merchants, and ambassadors who moved through his domains recorded impressions of markets, the hospitality of his officers, and the stability of civic life. These incidental observations add a human scale to the grand account of battles and treaties, reminding us that people lived, worked, worshipped, and loved under the umbrella of his authority. Saladin's approach to law and justice also bore practical footprints. Courts operated to adjudicate disputes, and local customs were often respected to maintain social order. His courts were hubs of negotiation where commerce, property, and personal grievances were resolved, and the integrity of such institutions mattered as much to the people as the triumphs on distant battlefields. The rhetorical power of his name continued to serve political ends. Leaders in later centuries invoked him when seeking to portray themselves as defenders of faith and territory. This selective invocation shows how historical figures can be repurposed as symbols to rally support or to legitimize contemporary policies. At the same time, the documentary record leaves gaps that resist full reconstruction. Some aspects of his private life are hazy, and certain events are filtered through chroniclers with their own agendas. Historians must piece together fragmentary sources, balancing Muslim narratives with European and Armenian accounts, to approach a plausible portrait of the man and his times. The complexity of his era requires us to attend to multiple threads: the ambitions of emirs, the rivalries of trading cities, the influence of religious institutions, and the unpredictable arrival of foreign armies. Saladin navigated all these with a mix of force, persuasion, and institutional building, creating a legacy that was as much structural as it was symbolic. His campaigns also had demographic and economic consequences. Cities changed hands, trade patterns shifted, and populations sometimes moved in response to conflict and new administrations. These shifts altered the social fabric of the Levant, with long-term effects on commerce, agriculture, and community life. One of the most enduring lessons from his life is the interplay between morality and interest in leadership. Saladin often framed decisions in moral terms, yet he made choices that were undeniably strategic. This blending of ethical language with political calculation is not unique to him, but he exemplified how moral authority can be wielded to serve practical ends. Saladin showed that leadership isn't just about power, it's about choices. Subscribe and tell us in the comments whether you respect him more for doing what's right or for doing what worked. Historians who look beneath the legend find a man who was frequently pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, and often astonishingly resilient. His life invites us to consider how leaders craft narratives to justify their actions and how they use both soft and hard power to achieve stability. That duality, ideal and instrument, helps explain why he remains such an intriguing figure. In local memory, his name is tied to place: a mosque restored here, a caravanserai rebuilt there, a bridge fixed to ensure markets could function. These tangible legacies remind communities that governance is not only about conquest but about building infrastructure that supports daily life. Such investments in the material world helped his regime endure beyond the immediate news of victory or defeat. Saladin's story also teaches us about the limits of individual greatness. His achievements were impressive, but the institutions he built required continuous attention and capable successors. No leader, no matter how gifted, can permanently fix the tides of history, yet the structures they establish can shape the possibilities for those who follow. As centuries passed, his figure continued to be taught in schools, celebrated in stories, and analyzed in political discourse. The many faces he wore, conqueror, administrator, devout Muslim, pragmatic ruler, allowed diverse groups to claim aspects of him for their causes. That plurality of ownership has kept debate alive and ensured that his life remains a subject of lively interest. Modern commemorations and museums sometimes highlight his role in history, offering artifacts and chronicles that invite visitors to imagine the world he inhabited. These exhibits seek to ground the myth in material evidence, providing testimony to both his achievements and the era that shaped them. They remind audiences that history is built from objects, documents, and the accounts of those who lived through the events. The question of moral evaluation continues to animate discussion of his legacy. Was he primarily a holy warrior or a shrewd politician? The honest answer is that he was both and more, a man whose decisions were shaped by a faith that informed his ethics, and by a political acumen that recognized the utility of mercy and severity alike. His life thus serves as a case study in the complex motives that drive historical actors. Finally, the echo of Saladin's life invites listeners to reflect on leadership in their own time. Greatness, defined by victory or by moral stature, is rarely uncomplicated. Leaders must weigh competing goods, balance short-term necessities against long-term aims, and recognize the human costs of political choices. Saladin's victories and compromises, his generosity and his firmness, all offer lessons about the enduring tensions that accompany power. The tale of Saladin remains a story of transitions, from local warrior to regional sovereign, from fragmented polity to nascent dynasty, from battlefield triumphs to the mundane work of governance. Each transition demanded new skills and new compromises, and his success lay in navigating these shifts with a steady hand. It is this capacity to transform personal prowess into institutional stability that cements his place in history. Listening to his story, we can imagine caravan lights shimmering at night, banners raised in dusty squares, the slow, deliberate rhythm of council meetings by candlelight, and the swift, chaotic burst of battle. These images remind us that history is a tapestry woven from countless human moments, and that figures like Saladin are threads that connect distinct eras into a continuous story. His life, in its many dimensions, remains a window into a world of complexity, faith, and relentless political imagination. When you first hear the name Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, or Saladin as later tongues would call him, it is easy to picture a single moment: the triumphant return to Jerusalem in 1187, the city's gates swinging open, the banners of a newly unified Muslim front fluttering in a wind that seems to sweep away years of division. That image fits the way stories like dramatic arcs, but the real story of his dream of a single faith unfolds slowly, out of 1,000 decisions, quiet reforms, and small compromises as much as by decisive battles. Saladin's life is less one great sweep than a patient composition, a long-reaching effort to bring together jurists and soldiers, merchants and mystics, kings and simple folk under a shared banner of Islamic unity. To understand that dream, you have to step back into a world full of competing authorities, where the idea of a single, coherent Muslim polity was as much aspiration as possibility. The age into which Saladin was born was one of fragmentation. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad still existed as a spiritual center, but political power had splintered into regional dynasties: Seljuk sultans in the east, Fatimid caliphs in Egypt with a Shia theology separating them from much of the Muslim world, and independent rulers in Syria and Anatolia. On top of those internal divisions, European Crusaders had established states along the Levantine coast after 1099, carving Christian principalities into lands that had once been connected by trade and pilgrimage routes. Fragmentation meant competing legal schools, local customs, castles that answered to distant lords, and sermons in different mosques appealing to different political masters. What Saladin inherited was not chaos alone, but a patchwork of loyalties and authorities that could be coaxed toward unity if handled with skill and vision. Saladin came from Kurdish stock, born in Tikrit in 1137, a son of the military aristocratic class that served higher powers. His father and uncle were part of the fabric of the Zengid dynasty, which itself had been a bulwark against the Crusader states and a rival to other Muslim rulers. As a young man, Saladin served under the Zengid leader Nur ad-Din in Syria, learning how power was exercised, how fortresses were garrisoned, how finances were balanced, and how the message of Islam could be deployed as both a unifying language and a legitimizing force. He was not born to rule a vast realm, rather he accumulated trust through competence, through loyalty, and through a reputation for piety and fair dealing that would later make political consolidation less foreign to those he sought to unite. There is a moment that historians trace as the first major turn in Saladin's career, his arrival in Egypt around 1163, sent as part of the Zengid entourage to assist the Fatimid court against internal unrest. Egypt at that time was a jewel of the medieval world, prosperous and cosmopolitan, but ruled by the Fatimids, an Ismaili Shia dynasty whose religious orientation set them apart from the Sunni majority of the surrounding lands. The Fatimids maintained their own administrative apparatus, their own judges, and their own religious institutions, and in Cairo the courts and bureaucrats had mastered the art of balancing power. Saladin, with his pragmatic mind and military skill, soon proved indispensable as a commander and administrator, gradually rising to the position of vizier, prime minister, under the Fatimid caliph. Becoming vizier put Saladin in the knot where secular governance and religious legitimacy intertwined. He was not merely a general, he now had the levers of tax collection, judicial appointments, and institutional patronage. With those levers he began a careful, deliberate process that would tilt Egypt away from Shia Ismaili institutions and back towards Sunni Islam as the dominant public orthodoxy. It was not an overnight conversion of the populace or an act of religious cleansing, but a reorganization of the state that prioritized Sunni scholars, restored Friday sermons in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and reshaped the legal and educational landscape. For many Egyptians, these changes would be felt in the mosques they attended and the courts they brought disputes to, not only in abstract theological debates. The idea of bringing Egypt into the Sunni fold served both spiritual and political purposes. Spiritually, realigning with Sunni Islam meant situating Cairo within the broader Muslim Ummah, the community of believers stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Politically, it opened the door to broader alliances with other Sunni powers, especially the Abbasid Caliphate, whose symbolic authority Saladin courted with great care. He knew that military power alone could not forge the unity he desired. Legitimacy had to be woven through institutions that people trusted, and in the medieval Islamic world that often meant marshaling the authority of judges, scholars, and religious endowments. The act of reinstating Sunni teachers and institutions was therefore as much a diplomatic act as it was a theological one. To grasp the depth of Saladin's reforms, consider the role of the madrasa, a school for the study of law and theology. Madrasas were not simply classrooms, they were centers of learning, hubs of legal interpretation, and seedbeds for the scholars who would advise courts and influence public opinion. Saladin patronized multiple madrasas and favored the Shafi'i legal school, one of the four mainstream Sunni schools of jurisprudence, though he did not entirely exclude others. By supporting teachers and students, endowing scholarships, and commissioning buildings, he created a network of thought that would outlast any single ruler's lifespan. It was a long game. The more jurists trained under the Sunni curriculum, the more the legal framework of society would reflect Sunni norms. That long game required more than houses of learning. It required the restructuring of the state's finances in ways that made these institutions sustainable. Saladin understood the power of waqf, endowments that funded mosques, schools, and public services in perpetuity, and he made careful use of them. By redirecting waqf revenues towards Sunni institutions, establishing stipends for teachers, and ensuring that charitable revenues served public goods, he anchored the transition in economic reality. People could sense change when their local mosques received funds, when the city's poor were fed more reliably, and when the legal system offered predictable recourse. Economic measures bolstered doctrinal ones, and that intersection is where much of Saladin's unifying work found its practical shape. At the same time, Saladin could not ignore the military and political threats arrayed against the dream of a single faith. The Crusader states along the Levantine coast were entrenched, fortified, and supplied through sea lanes that allowed reinforcements and funds to cross from Europe. To many Muslims, these Christian principalities were not merely foreign occupiers, but a moral crisis calling for coherent response. Saladin framed his military campaigns in language that combined practical strategy with spiritual urgency. He spoke of jihad in the sense of exertion for the defense and recovery of Muslim lands, but he also kept his rhetoric measured enough to reassure local rulers who might fear centralized overreach. There is a complicated dance here between the language of religious solidarity and the concrete necessity of building coalitions across cultural and regional lines. It is important to be clear about what Saladin's unification did and did not accomplish. He did not create a monolithic, centrally administered empire in the way that some later empires would. His realm remained a composite. Familial governors, loyal military commanders, and allied princes all retained degrees of autonomy. The unification he sought was as much about legal and religious standardization as it was about political control. By aligning the public rituals, legal norms, and institutional structures of major cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo, he knitted together a common framework within which diverse actors could operate more harmoniously. It was a federation of loyalties rather than an empire of uniform command. His military successes, especially the capture of Jerusalem after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, were powerful symbols of this new alignment. Jerusalem had been under Christian control for almost a century, and its recovery was passionately felt across the Muslim world. Saladin's entrance into the city was both triumphant and measured. He behaved not as a fanatical zealot tearing the city apart, but as a ruler mindful of the practicalities of governance and coexistence. He allowed many Christians to leave peacefully and negotiated ransoms for captives, a policy that fit his broader style, assertive yet pragmatic. That blend of martial decisiveness and restrained magnanimity made his victories more than tactical wins. They became elements of a narrative about what a united Islamic front could accomplish. Saladin's reforms also touched the symbolism of legitimacy in ways that mattered at a distance. In Friday sermons, the khutbah, he had the name of the Abbasid caliph proclaimed, thereby recognizing the older caliph's spiritual primacy and in return gaining a stamp of orthodoxy. The khutbah had been a way rulers signaled allegiance or independence for centuries. By using it strategically, Saladin reaffirmed a sense of common belonging across the Muslim world. Similarly, coinage bore inscriptions that signaled belonging to a wider political space, and such everyday symbols reinforced the sense that disparate provinces were part of a single religious civilization. These cultural and ceremonial details mattered precisely because, in a pre-modern world, ritual and symbolism often did the work that constitutions and mass media do today. No consolidation effort escaped resistance, and Saladin faced his share of critics and opponents. Some local elites resented losing influence. Ismaili loyalists and Fatimid officials saw their positions erode. The process of changing judges and teachers risked alienating communities attached to older traditions. Yet Saladin's approach was rarely to purge. More often he offered alternative roles, pensions, or negotiated settlements that made transitions less brutal than they might have been. Even his enemies noted his fairness. Chroniclers record moments where his generous conduct toward the vanquished earned him respect and even loyalty. In the messy reality of politics, his moderation frequently proved a strategic strength. Saladin's personal piety was an essential component of his moral authority. He cultivated an image and, according to many contemporary eyewitnesses, lived a life of modesty, prayer, and charity. Unlike rulers who surrounded themselves with luxury to communicate power, he often chose simplicity, not merely for optics but as a reflection of his values. That personal example made his broader project more intelligible. He was not merely an ambitious lord seeking to dominate, but a pious man seeking to reorder public life toward what he believed to be the right form of religious and civic governance. That combination of humility and vigor allowed people to imagine him as a unifier rather than simply a conqueror. The role of the military, and particularly the use of slave soldiers or Mamluks, was central to Saladin's capacity to project power. Mamluks were often enslaved youths who were trained as soldiers and could rise to positions of great influence and responsibility. Saladin employed such troops effectively, building a dependable military backbone that was personally loyal to him while also balancing tribal horsemen and local levies. This professionalized military allowed for rapid response to threats and more disciplined campaigns than ad hoc forces could provide. Yet the reliance on Mamluks also planted seeds for future change, because the very institution that helped Saladin stabilize his realm would later produce power centers of its own. Administration after conquest required more than troops. It required a legal and bureaucratic class that could adjudicate disputes, collect taxes, and ensure public order. Saladin's efficient administrators reorganized taxation systems in ways that secured revenue while avoiding crippling burdens on the populace, at least compared to the more extractive regimes of other eras. He made use of ikta, grants of land or revenue to military officers, which tied military service to economic sustenance and made soldiers invested in the stability of the state. At the same time, he avoided over-centralization by delegating significant authority to trusted lieutenants, a pragmatic arrangement that preserved unity while allowing local governance to function. The result was a mosaic administrative system that combined central objectives with local knowledge. In the realm of law, Saladin's favoring of the Shafi'i school did not erase other Sunni traditions. The Shafi'i school became prominent in many of the key institutions he established, but the Hanafi and Maliki schools remained present in various regions, and the Hanbali school retained influence among conservative groups. Saladin's objective was practical conformity rather than doctrinal purity. A common legal framework made it easier to reconcile disputes across cities and reduced friction among merchants and travelers. When people could predict how a court would behave or how contracts would be adjudicated, trade and movement became safer. In this way, legal harmonization served both spiritual unity and economic integration. Saladin also forged relationships with the centers of Islamic scholarship beyond his immediate realm. He corresponded with scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and the Islamic West, seeking their endorsements and inviting their participation in the intellectual life of his courts. These connections lent reciprocity to his project. Scholars affirmed the religious changes he enacted, and in return they received patronage and protection. The cross-pollination of ideas was not merely theological but also practical. Scholars advised on taxation, on public morality, and on the ethics of war and governance. Their voices helped shape a culture in which political unity and religious cohesion were two sides of the same coin. While Saladin aimed to unify Islam in the public and ritual sense, he was not a uniformer of private conscience. Historical records suggest he tolerated Jewish and Christian communities under his rule, granting them protection albeit under the terms of dhimma, a status that prescribed certain limitations and protections for non-Muslim communities. This arrangement preserved social diversity while still maintaining a hierarchic order aligned with Islamic legal norms. The coexistence he allowed was less a liberal pluralism than a pragmatic accommodation that kept cities functioning and commerce flowing. In practice, this meant markets remained cosmopolitan, artisans continued their work, and intellectual exchange could occur even amid theological boundaries. It is instructive to look at how Saladin managed places of extreme symbolic importance, like Jerusalem, after their recovery. He placed emphasis on restoring and maintaining Islamic holy sites and ensuring that pilgrimage and religious life could proceed safely. Yet he was also mindful of the practicalities of urban life, sanitation, water supply, marketplaces, and the management of incoming pilgrims required steady governance. His administration of such spaces reflected his broader philosophy: stability and dignity mattered as much as triumph. And people noticed the difference between a city ruled with yesterday's chaos and a city reorganized with a longer view toward order. Saladin's diplomatic skills deserve attention because they complemented his military prowess. He negotiated with other Muslim princes, making alliances when needed and accepting rivalries when unavoidable. Sometimes he married into powerful families, sometimes he offered political offices, and sometimes he granted autonomy in exchange for loyalty. His diplomacy was not purely transactional, it was animated by a vision that sought a larger coherence. Even when he had to fight, he often sought to minimize internecine conflict that would fracture the Muslim response to external threats. In his mind, internal fighting was a luxury the Ummah could ill afford when enemies loomed at the borders. Not every ally's loyalty was rooted in religious conviction. Many rulers supported Saladin because their material interests aligned with his success. Merchants wanted safe trade routes, landlords wanted predictable tax regimes, and judges wanted institutional continuity. By tying religious reform to these material benefits, Saladin turned theological alignment into something that also served everyday needs. This blending of moral and material incentives created a momentum that sometimes seemed to carry people with it, rather than forcing them under an imposed order. In time, what began as policy became habit. Friday prayers, legal decisions, and educational curricula adjusted to the rhythms he set. Architecture and urban improvement played their role in making Saladin's vision concrete. He invested in repairing and strengthening fortresses, in building bridges and caravanserais, inns for traveling merchants, and in maintaining roads. Such projects were not merely beautification, they were strategic. Safer roads meant safer pilgrimage and commerce, and well-maintained fortresses meant that centers of authority would not crumble under sudden assault. By shaping the physical environment, Saladin shaped the human behaviors that depended on it. Travel, trade, and religious practice became less risky and more regular. Buildings can be stubborn teachers. When they stand for generations, they teach citizens how to move, pray, and transact within a shared system. Saladin's day-to-day leadership displayed a paradox of gentleness and severity. In battle, he could be relentless. In governance, he could be magnanimous. He executed strategies that required hard choices, sieges that starved enemies, sieges that accepted surrenders and paid heed to civilized limits. But after victory, he often treated populations with a clemency that was both morally honest and politically smart. Clemency reassured new subjects that their lives would matter and that cooperation would be more fruitful than resistance. That pattern recurred. When people believed they would be treated fairly, many chose accommodation over resistance, and the process of consolidation accelerated. Religious scholars and Sufi mystics also influenced the cultural atmosphere Saladin cultivated. Sufism, with its emphasis on personal piety and devotional practice, enjoyed patronage during his time and provided a spiritual depth that reached ordinary people in ways philosophical treatises could not. Saladin was careful not to allow mystics to become political actors in ways that undermined public order, but he recognized that spiritual movements could be a source of moral energy for his project. The presence of Sufi orders and charismatic preachers knitted together devotional life across regions, and their emotional appeal often made abstract doctrinal unity feel intimate and tangible. The rhetoric of jihad that Saladin used was complex, carefully balanced to rally Muslims against the Crusader states while avoiding sectarian strife that would fracture his alliances. He invoked the language of defense and reclamation more than a blanket call for holy war against all non-Muslims, which allowed him to focus energies on specific strategic goals. This selective use of religious vocabulary helped build a coalition that included people motivated by faith, honor, economic interest, and political calculation. In that coalition, the dream of a single faith had practical outlets, coordinated military campaigns, shared legal expectations, and ritual synchrony during major religious festivals. Even as Saladin was achieving these remarkable feats of cohesion, he faced the relentless friction of personality and family. After his death, the political unity he had assembled unraveled to varying degrees as sons and nephews squabbled for territory. That posthumous fragmentation highlights an inherent tension in his method. He had relied on personal loyalty and cultivated bonds that were not easily institutionalized for the long term. The Ayyubid family he founded was capable but human. Dynastic politics, as in all eras, proved resistant to the neat logic of centralized succession. Historians often point to this as a lesson. Personal virtues can create temporary cohesion, but durable unity needs institutional anchors beyond a single leader's charisma. The immediate aftermath of Saladin's death in 1193 did not erase his legacy. Even as the realm was divided and the Crusader threat persisted, the institutional changes he had made, madrasa networks, legal realignment, and economic reforms, continued to shape life in the region. The Ayyubid polity remained a force for Sunni consolidation for decades, and later the Mamluks, the very military class that Saladin had helped empower, would carry forward many of his institutional legacies in their own ways. If political borders shifted, cultural and legal currents continued to flow in a direction his reforms had strengthened. In the long arc of history, his imprint proved deeper than the immediate political map alone might suggest. Beyond the immediate centuries, Saladin's name enjoyed an extraordinary afterlife. Muslim chroniclers praised him as the paragon of chivalry and piety, a ruler who had combined bravery with generosity and devotion with prudence. European writers, too, though often as enemies, attributed to him an almost mythic nobility, the chivalric ideal found in him a worthy counterpart. These cross-cultural echoes helped transform him into a figure of legend, someone who could be cited in moral tales, political rhetoric, and literary depictions for generations. Legends smooth edges and amplify virtues. They do not tell the whole story, but they point to the human longing for leaders who unite strength with principle. Modern political movements and national narratives have also laid claim to Saladin, sometimes selectively emphasizing aspects of his story that fit contemporary aims. In 19th and 20th century nationalisms, he has been invoked as an archetype of resistance and unity against foreign domination. Such uses select parts of his life, military success, anti-Crusader rhetoric, while eliding other dimensions, like his accommodation of diverse communities or his dynastic politics. This appropriation is a reminder that historical figures are often reinscribed to meet present needs. The past always arrives in the present with a certain malleability, and Saladin's image has been pressed into multiple molds because he embodies values that various audiences find inspirational. To appreciate Saladin's dream of a single faith fully, one must consider the lived experiences of ordinary people in the lands he governed. Markets, neighborhoods, mosques, and courts are the granular places where unity becomes felt. When a merchant from Aleppo could trust a Damascus contract, when a pilgrim from Cairo could find shelter in the route to Mecca, when a small-town judge applied laws recognizable to an itinerant scholar, those were the moments the unity Saladin sought became more than a slogan. In the end, the dream was not merely an imperial slogan but a set of practical changes that affected how people traded, worshipped, and settled disputes. Unity, for him, lived in the texture of daily life. We should also reflect on the ethical tensions inherent in unification projects. Bringing divergent communities under a single religious framework can deepen solidarity, but it can also marginalize minority voices and erase local pluralities. Saladin navigated these tensions in ways that combined tolerance with hierarchy and pragmatism with principle. He never eradicated difference, rather he structured it so that a dominant orthodoxy prevailed in public life while allowing a degree of private difference. For many, that compromise provided stability; for others, it felt like a narrowing of freedom. The moral calculus of his policies continues to provoke reflection about the costs and benefits of unity in diverse societies. In the broader sweep of Middle Eastern history, Saladin's era is often read as a hinge point between fragmentation and the later emergence of more centralized polities. The Mamluk Sultanate that rose after the Ayyubids built on some of his institutional frameworks while adding its own military and administrative logics. Even the Ottoman Empire, which unified much of the Muslim world centuries later, inherited a world where the idea of religious political unity was plausible because of the precedents established by leaders like Saladin. He did not invent unity, but he demonstrated robust methods for achieving it under the specific conditions of his age. His efforts reverberated in ways that shaped political imagination for generations. The literary and cultural portrayals of Saladin deserve a closer look because they helped construct his reputation over time. Arabic biographies and histories celebrated his humility, his generosity to the poor, and his merciful treatment of enemies. Western romances admired his knightly honor and packed respect with chivalric adversaries like Richard the Lionheart. These portrayals smoothed away inconvenient details and built a character who could be admired across cultural boundaries. That selective memory speaks to a deeper truth. Societies often fashion heroes who embody aspirations, and Saladin fit many such aspirations. Yet he was also a calculating leader, capable of ruthlessness when circumstances demanded, which complicates any simple hagiography. Saladin's use of written correspondence and formal decrees was another pillar of his unifying strategy. By issuing letters to governors, to neighboring princes, and to scholars, he created a paper trail of commitments and promises. These documents mattered because they made intentions public and provided a form of accountability. They also standardized expectations across distance. In an era without modern communication technologies, a well-crafted decree carried authority not only by content but by the weight of its maker's reputation. People read and reread such decrees. They became part of the legal cultural archive that sustained the unity he sought. It is useful to remember that Saladin's dream was not static; it evolved as circumstances shifted. Early on, he prioritized securing Egypt and establishing a base of resources. Later, his focus broadened to the recovery of Jerusalem and the creation of a regional coalition. Within each phase, his tactics adapted, sometimes conciliatory, sometimes uncompromising, according to the needs of the moment. That adaptability was a central feature of his effectiveness. A rigid leader might set a single path and fail when conditions changed. Saladin's flexibility allowed him to pursue a long-term vision through a succession of shorter-term maneuvers. What does the dream of a single faith look like to a historian thinking centuries later? It appears as a combination of institutional designs, rhetorical appeals, and the strategic use of resources to align diverse actors. It is a project that required legal harmonization, educational patronage, administrative reorganization, military restructuring, and symbolic acts of allegiance. Importantly, it reveals how religious unity and political stability often feed each other. Shared religious forms make collective action easier, and political stability allows religious institutions to flourish. Saladin's experiment shows both the possibilities and limitations of such an approach in a pre-modern milieu. By the time of his death, Saladin had transformed the map of allegiance across the eastern Mediterranean. Many previously warring or isolated regions now recognized a common set of institutions and rituals. That transformation did not last unchanged, but it set patterns that would be revised, adapted, and reused by successors. His name became shorthand for a certain kind of rulership, martial courage blended with a concern for justice, charisma married to administrative competence. Such a combination proved potent in an age where symbols and governance had to work in tandem to keep polities intact. Listening to his story today, we can learn about the interplay between ambition and restraint, between public ritual and private belief, and between military necessity and administrative craft. Saladin's life invites reflection on how leaders might pursue unity without annihilating difference, how they might use religious frameworks to motivate cooperation while avoiding sectarian violence. These are familiar challenges in any era, and the medieval lens offers a rich case study of both successes and failures. Understanding the contours of his policy helps clarify the hard work of governance that lies behind grand historical narratives. In the end, the dream of a single faith that Saladin pursued was less a narrow program of enforced conformity than a complex set of policies aimed at creating a shared public architecture of belief and practice. He reshaped legal systems, rebuilt institutions, patronized scholars, and marshaled military might in service of a vision that balanced spiritual goals with political pragmatism. The consequences were mixed. Some communities thrived, others felt marginalized, but the overall pattern moved the region toward a more coherent Sunni public sphere. That coherence, imperfect as it was, made possible coordinated responses to external threats and created a cultural continuity that would be felt long after Saladin himself was gone. It is tempting to reduce historical figures to a few iconic episodes, but the fuller reality of Saladin's life shows the patient, often unglamorous labor of statecraft. He negotiated treaties, managed grain supplies, appointed judges, debated scholars, and consoled widows as much as he led sieges and made proclamations. Those everyday acts, repeated and institutionalized, built the network of trust and expectation that allowed greater things to be achieved. In the quiet spaces of governance, the dream of unity was hammered out step by step. Even the skeptics of his day and later found it difficult to deny certain facts. Under Saladin's rule, cities became safer, commerce more predictable, and certain forms of learning flourished. Those material improvements mattered in themselves, but they mattered also because they reinforced the idea that a society organized around common religious norms could deliver tangible benefits. For many people, the practical advantages of his reforms validated the religious claims he promoted. When people saw security and justice, religious unity felt less like an abstract requirement and more like a lived reality that improved daily life. At the same time, it is important to honor the diversity of voices that persisted and sometimes resisted. Religious minorities, various Sunni legal schools, and regional elites each experienced Saladin's reforms differently. While some embraced the new order, others adapted out of prudence, and still others sought ways to preserve their traditions within the altered landscape. The story of unification, then, is not a tale of homogeneous acceptance but a complex mosaic of accommodations, resistances, and negotiated settlements. That mosaic is where the human texture of history becomes most palpable. So when you think of Saladin's dream now, imagine not only the drama of battlefield victories or the romance of chivalric legend but the small, enduring acts of building, a madrasa endowed here, a judge appointed there, a caravanserai repaired to protect a merchant's path. These are ordinary strokes on the canvas of statecraft, but they add up. The dream of a single faith was ultimately realized not by decree alone but by the slow accretion of institutions, habits, and shared expectations that made Muslim society more coherent across space and time. If there is a lesson in this for listeners today, it is that unity requires both principle and pragmatism. It needs leaders who can inspire with ideals and then translate those ideals into systems that people can use in their daily lives. Saladin found a way to do that within the medieval legal and religious systems of his time. He appealed to shared beliefs, reformed institutions, and cultivated loyalty through personal example and fair governance. The result was a partial, imperfect, but deeply influential realization of the dream he pursued. And so the story winds toward a simple truth: historical dreams are rarely fully fulfilled, but they can change the world. Saladin did not forge a permanent, unchanging unity, but he set in motion forces that reshaped the political and religious contours of the Middle East for centuries. His blend of pious conviction, administrative skill, military competence, and personal restraint produced a model of leadership that has been admired, debated, and reimagined ever since. Listening to his life, we hear not only the crash of arms and the shouts of triumph, but the steady rhythms of governance that make collective life possible. Ultimately, Saladin's dream of a single faith was a gamble on the power of institutions and symbols to bind people together. He invested in education, in law, in piety, and in public welfare, believing that these elements could produce a coherence that outlived his own lifetime. The gamble paid off in many ways. It created networks of scholars and judges, it reshaped public rituals, and it offered a template for subsequent rulers to follow. Even though the political map shifted after his death, the cultural and religious alignments he fostered carried forward, proving that certain forms of unity, once established, can become self-sustaining. History remembers Saladin in many voices: the chronicler who admires his courage, the jurist who respects his legal reforms, the merchant who profits from safer trade routes, and the poet who praises his generosity. Each voice highlights a facet of the complex jewel that was his rule. Put together, these voices tell a story of a leader who sought not domination for its own sake, but an order in which faith and public life moved in harmony. That aspiration, both noble and imperfect, makes Saladin a figure worth hearing about, not as a museum piece, but as a living example of how political imagination and religious conviction can make common cause. The sun rises over a land stitched together by dunes and stones, by orchards and ruined towers, and the story I will tell begins in that light. It is not a short tale, nor a tidy one. It is a weave of battle cries and prayers, of trees read by lamplight and horses dying in the dust. At its center stands a man the chroniclers called Saladin, Saladin to those who would learn his name by the mouth of Europeans, a figure whose life would collide with the crusading kings who crossed the sea to wrest Jerusalem from Muslim control. To understand Saladin, we must first understand the world into which he was born, a world where faith and power clasped hands and then turned on each other. The 11th and 12th centuries were an age of movement, of pilgrims and merchants and soldiers pushing against borders both physical and imagined. The Crusades were not one event but a series of eruptions, fervor, politics, and greed braided together, and they reshaped societies on both sides of the Mediterranean. He came from a family that was Kurdish by origin, but the label fails to carry the simple truth of a man shaped by many places. Saladin grew up in a world of mixed languages and loyalties, where Arabic and Turkish echoes overlapped, where the deserts met mountain passes, and where the call to prayer rose above many tongues. His early years were carved by the campaigns of the great Atabegs and sultans of Syria and Iraq, and by the patronage of men who gave him his first chance to rise. Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, was a soldier of fortune in this volatile landscape, a man who would take the younger Sulla under his wing and teach him the measures of war. Shirkuh's campaigns in Egypt, fighting the Fatimid dynasty and the Crusader states, became the crucible in which Saladin learned both the art of command and the necessity of restraint. When he arrived in Egypt, the land was a place of Byzantine tapestries and Coptic churches, and yet it was a prize for those who could control the Nile and the grain that fed empires. Egypt at the time was a flaring jewel and a tinderbox at once. Its wealth drew conquerors, its political structures invited intrigue, and its strategic importance made it a prize in the larger struggle for the Levant. Saladin saw Egypt not only as a field of battle but as a base upon which to build a broader realm, a launchpad to unite fractured Muslim polities against the Crusader states. He recognized that military victories alone would not suffice. Law, administration, and public perception would all matter. Rising through ranks, Saladin became known for a combination of stern discipline and a personal charm that could win allies where brute force would have driven men away. He moved through tents and palaces with a quiet intensity, listening to advisors, observing marshals, and noting the weaknesses of men who believed their swords could replace wisdom. That ability to combine the soldier's eye with the statesman's patience would prove decisive in the decades to come. When Saladin took the reins of power in Egypt after Shirkuh's death, he found himself at the helm of a state that had been torn by internal rivalries and threatened by external forces. The Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty whose legitimacy had been in decline, offered an opening. Saladin methodically neutralized factions that opposed him, balanced alliances between Turks and Arabs, and gradually shifted the state's institutions towards Sunni orthodoxy in a manner that seemed as carefully planned as any siege. This transformation was not merely religious theater, it had practical consequences. Bringing Egypt into the orbit of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad helped legitimize Saladin's authority and allowed him to gather support across the Muslim world. Trade routes became steadier, tax systems more predictable, and the hard business of raising armies and supplying them to face foes across the eastern Mediterranean became possible on a new scale. From this Egyptian base, Saladin looked toward Syria and the lands of the Levant, where the Crusader states, Antioch, Tripoli, the county of Edessa in earlier times, and most importantly the Kingdom of Jerusalem, held fortified cities and coastal strongholds. Those states were not monoliths, they were palimpsests of European knights, local Christians, merchants, and often uneasy alliances with Muslim neighbors. Yet to Saladin they were the outward projection of a threat that could not be ignored. The leaders of the Christian kingdoms were as varied as the lands they ruled. Some were barons with castles along the coast, men who had come from Normandy or France and who clung to feudal customs transplanted from Europe. Others were kings who dreamed of glory and sought the prestige of pilgrimage and conquest. Richard of England, Philip of France, and Frederick Barbarossa would enter the story later. But before their time, the kings and princes who held the Latin East offered a target for Saladin's ambition to restore Muslim control over Jerusalem and its environs. Conflict in the region took many shapes: pitched battles, long sieges, raids across open country, and diplomatic negotiations that lasted months. Saladin cultivated a reputation for both fierceness in war and clemency in victory, a dual image that kept his enemies wary and his own subjects hopeful. His victories were sometimes swift and brutal, but just as often they were tempered by an awareness that mercy could be a tool of statecraft, a way to bind conquered peoples to a new order without destroying the economic and human fabric that made cities thrive. By the 1170s and early 1180s, Saladin had expanded his control across Egypt and into Syria, bringing under his leadership cities such as Damascus and Aleppo in a manner that suggested not chaotic conquest but a deliberate strategy of consolidation. He faced rivals within the Muslim world, local dynasts, ambitious emirs, and the lingering power of the Crusader states, yet he navigated these dangers with a blend of negotiation, selective violence, and administrative reform. Each campaign, each marriage arranged, each envoy received at a palace door tightened the weave of his growing dominion. Then came the summer of 1187, a year that would be seared into memory across continents, the Battle of Hattin. On a parched plain off the Sea of Galilee, and hills stitched with scrub and rock, Saladin faced the assembled forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in a clash that would change the map of the Levant. The Christians marched with banners bright against the sky, confident or compelled by chivalric codes and political pressures to throw their weight against the Muslim host. Saladin, by contrast, had learned to use terrain and thirst as weapons. He denied the Crusaders access to water sources, he harried their foragers, and he kept the momentum of his cavalry to break enemy formations. The sun and the thirst it inflicted are often spoken of as natural forces, but under Saladin's command they were shaped into strategic tools. The knights, heavy in armor, became vulnerable as their horses tired and their lines disintegrated. When the decisive moment came at Hattin, it was not the clash of shining swords alone that decided the day but years of preparation and the stewarding of alliances. Saladin's troops encircled and overwhelmed the Crusader force, and the king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, was captured. Along with him were many nobles and a panoply of banners whose fall signaled a collapse of military organization that had stood on the eastern shores for almost a century. The routed Hattin opened the gates to a chain of cities and fortresses. Within weeks, Saladin's banners were raised over Acre, Nablus, and finally Jerusalem itself. The fall of Jerusalem in October of 1187 was a turning point that reverberated to the courts of Europe and into the thoughts of popes and princes who feared the loss of the holy city. It was not a simple sack. Saladin entered Jerusalem with a strategic mixture of reverence and firmness, and his treatment of the city's Christian inhabitants would become a cornerstone of his historic reputation. When Saladin took Jerusalem, he did not level the city in revenge. He levied ransom for prisoners, negotiated terms, and allowed many Christians to depart freely if they could pay for their salvation. To some in Europe this seemed an act of magnanimity, to others it was pragmatic politics. The image of Saladin as merciful king was crafted in part by those very acts of moderated severity, but it is important to remember the calculation beneath such decisions. Every life spared that could later pay taxes or work the fields was a resource for the new administration. Word of Jerusalem's fall traversed oceans and mountains, carried on ships and in letters, arriving at the courts of kings like a spark to dry tinder. European rulers debated the response. Prelates preached new crusades, knights took up the cross again with vows and oaths. The Third Crusade, led by the likes of Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, formed in reaction to the loss of Jerusalem, determined to wrest the city back or at least to restore Christian control along parts of the coast. Saladin watched these stirrings closely. He did not underestimate his opponents, and he knew that European kings carried military skill and a zeal bolstered by papal sanction. Yet he also had advantages: local knowledge, shorter supply lines, the unity of his leadership, and the support of many local populations who preferred his rule to distant foreign lords. The stage was set for a series of encounters where honor, rivalry, and strategic calculation would interlace. The character of the opposing Christian kings mattered. Richard of England was a commander of restless energy, gifted in warfare and famed for his chivalrous ruthlessness. Philip of France was often cautious, inclined toward political maneuver. Frederick Barbarossa embodied imperial threat from the north before his death en route, leaving a vacuum of command and altering the balance of the crusading coalition. These permutations among the European leaders gave Saladin chances to exploit disunity even as he prepared for direct confrontation. The campaigns that followed were not a single campaign but a set of intermittent struggles: sieges at Acre, skirmishes in the hills, negotiations under flags of truce, and acts of personal daring. Acre became a focal point. That port city was a strategic choke point, a gateway to Jerusalem, and whoever controlled it could control the flow of men and goods. Saladin besieged and was besieged. He negotiated and then resumed fighting. He showed patience where other commanders might have forced a premature hand. One of the era's striking features was the personal interchange between leaders on opposite sides. Letters passed from Saladin to Richard, and from Richard to Saladin, bearing words of threat, of challenge, and sometimes of begrudging respect. These communications revealed that both men imagined themselves acting within codes of honor that transcended mere enmity. They traded barbs and tests of virtue, but they also acknowledged each other's prowess and place in the fight for the Holy Land. On the field, Richard proved a formidable opponent in several battles, winning tactical victories and demonstrating the military discipline of his forces. Yet his victories were rarely decisive enough to reach Jerusalem itself. Saladin's strategy of avoiding a suicidal charge for the Holy City, and his preference for wearing down the enemy in the field and under siege, created a protracted war of attrition where supply lines, weather, and diplomacy mattered as much as the clangor of steel. The famous encounter at the Horns of Hattin had already shown Saladin's mastery of combining terrain and timing. Later skirmishes, the march to Jaffa and the clashes at Arsuf, tested both sides' endurance. Richard won battles that made European chroniclers roar with praise and wrote of deeds that would be echoed in ballads for generations. Saladin, for all his skill, realized that he could not always confront Richard's thrusts directly and instead sought to protect the heartland of his realm and cut off the Crusaders' support. Amid these military operations, there were moments that revealed Saladin's complexity. Stories, sometimes true and sometimes embroidered, tell of him refusing ransom in order to include the poor among the prisoners released, or of his giving medical care to wounded enemies. Whether every anecdote is exact or colored by myth, the aggregate picture is of a ruler who valued his reputation as much as his conquests. Mercy could be a policy, and likewise cruelty could be diplomacy when it served to warn others. Yet he was also ruthless when he needed to be. In areas where resistance was fierce or where defiance threatened the stability of his nascent state, Saladin acted with severity. The line between magnanimity and brutality is thin in wartime, and he did not shrink from implementing punishments that consolidated control. His judgments were pragmatic, guided by the political necessity of holding lands won and of denying the Crusaders any foothold they sought to reclaim. As the Third Crusade ground on, neither side could claim a final, complete victory. Richard's forces recovered some coastal cities and secured passage for pilgrims, but he could not retake Jerusalem. Saladin kept the city under Muslim rule but found his resources strained by extended warfare and the costs of administering a large empire. Exhaustion and negotiation gradually shaped a compromise that both men could live with, if not completely satisfy their respective publics. The Treaty of Jaffa in 1192, the result of arduous diplomacy, left Jerusalem in Muslim hands but assured safe passage for Christian pilgrims and established a relatively stable frontier. It was not the dramatic coronation either side might have hoped for, but it was a pragmatic arrangement that reflected the limits both leaders faced. The treaty showed that war often ends not in total surrender but in mutual accommodation, where the memory of battle molds the borders and manners of a region. In those final years, Saladin's fame grew beyond the immediate theater of conflict. Stories of his chivalry traveled through Christian courts, surprising many who had expected only brute hostility. To some, he became an archetype of noble enemyhood, fierce on the field but concerned with honor off it. Those stories were carried into the chronicles and poems of both Muslim and Christian writers, and they helped craft a legacy that would outlast the men themselves. Saladin's death in 1193 brought a sudden quiet to a life lived amid thunder. He fell ill in Damascus and passed away amid the ministrations of devoted followers, leaving a realm that was strong in some respects and fragile in others. He had united diverse territories under a single dynasty, the Ayyubid house, but he had not built institutions that could seamlessly replace his personal authority. Succession disputes would fragment his realm in the decades that followed, yet his memory continued to loom large. The impact of Saladin's career cannot be measured solely in cities gained or kings humbled. It includes the shape he gave to political identities, the way he reimagined Muslim unity, and the cultural memory he inspired on both sides of the Mediterranean. For Muslims, he became a symbol of resistance against foreign incursion and of a ruler who combined piety with statecraft. For Europeans, he appeared as a worthy antagonist, sometimes romanticized, sometimes vilified, always respected for his prowess. Legends blossomed around his figure, blooming into tales of duels, generosity, and strange encounters. Some stories magnify details into parables: the tale of Saladin and the Christian knight who asked for his armor, the account of a ransomed city letting its people go free, the image of a sultan who prayed for guidance while planning sieges. These tales, repeated and reshaped, fed the imagination of poets and chroniclers, turning a historical man into something larger than life. Historians have since sifted through sources, Arabic chronicles, Latin accounts, letters, and later narratives, to pull closer to the man beneath the myth. Each source carries biases: the Muslim chronicler writing to praise a sultan, the Christian writer aiming to shame the enemy or to praise his own leaders, the merchants who remember tariffs and safe roads with interest. The truth is complex, and the interplay between legend and record reflects the layered reality of medieval politics. Beyond legend and text, Saladin's policies affected ordinary people in practical ways. Markets and farms needed protection, legal systems had to adjudicate disputes, and religious communities required management. Saladin and his administrators worked to keep roads open for pilgrims and merchants, to maintain granaries, and to collect taxes in ways that could fund armies without destroying the economic base. These mundane decisions were the scaffolding of empire. Military innovation and organization are often foregrounded in tales of conquest, but the logistical arts behind Saladin's campaigns warrant attention. Fields had to be harvested, horses shod, weapons repaired, and supplies shipped along coastlines and through mountain passes. Engineers and camp followers, cooks and scribes, made campaigns possible, and Saladin's ability to mobilize such a system was as crucial as the sword strokes of his knights. Diplomacy, too, played a continuous role. Saladin negotiated not only with European kings but with Mongols and neighboring Muslim rulers, with merchants and local notables, with religious leaders whose sermons could inflame or calm a city. He used marriage alliances, promises of revenue, and the granting of land or titles as tools to secure support. His success in keeping a broad coalition together was a testament to his political fluency as much as to his martial skill. Religion, while a clear motivator for the Crusaders, was also a binding force in Saladin's strategy. He presented himself as a defender of Islam and used religious symbolism to rally support, but he understood the pragmatic limits of zealotry. Respect for scholars and the promotion of institutions of learning helped consolidate his moral authority and bolstered the legitimacy of his rule in the eyes of subjects who cared about both piety and prosperity. The Crusades themselves were shaped by a mixture of spiritual fervor and earthly ambition. For many knights, pilgrimage, penance, and the promise of eternal reward were intertwined with desires for land and honor. For rulers like Saladin, defending Muslim lands was a sacred duty and a means to unify disparate groups under a shared banner. That intersection of sacred and secular motives is what gives the period so much of its dramatic intensity. Saladin's diplomatic correspondence reveals a man attuned to the art of image-making. His letters to kings and to clerics, his responses to ambassadors, and the proclamations made in mosques were crafted to present himself as righteous, formidable, and fair. He used rhetoric to frame battles as necessary and treaties as concessions to reason, seeking to legitimize his actions at home and to dissuade further incursions from abroad. The European perception of Saladin evolved over time. Initially a formidable and often demonized foe, he became a figure of chivalric admiration in later retellings. Troubadours and writers recast certain episodes into tales of honor, and chroniclers found in his behavior echoes of their own ideals of noble conduct. This cross-cultural admiration reveals something about the shared codes of medieval elites, where martial prowess and generosity could be recognized even in an enemy. The physical landscape of the Levant, too, influenced how wars were waged. The coastlines offered ports and supply lines, the interior plains allowed for cavalry maneuvers, the hills and fortresses provided defensive advantages that favored determined defenders. Saladin learned to adapt to this geography, selecting battlefields that suited his strengths and avoiding direct assaults on impregnable castles when supply and siege engines were lacking. On the other side, European leaders tried to leverage naval power, using fleets to land troops and to blockade ports. The struggle for control of the sea lanes added another dimension to the conflict, making the Crusades both a land war and a contest for maritime dominance. The ebb and flow of these naval operations affected sieges on land and the ability of reinforcements to reach a battlefield in time. Beyond armies and treaties, cultural exchange marked the age. Artists, architects, and scholars moved between courts. The translation of texts, the sharing of medical knowledge, and the mingling of culinary practices all occurred even amid the conflict. These exchanges were less heralded than battles but arguably as enduring. They altered the material and intellectual life of regions touched by the Crusades. The administrative reforms Saladin instituted in Egypt and Syria had a long tail. They reconfigured land tenure, clarified tax obligations, and sought to professionalize military provisioning. Such work is often invisible in tales of war, yet it was essential to the sustainability of his campaigns. If a commander cannot feed his troops, he cannot fight. If he cannot fund engineers, he cannot besiege well-defended walls. Saladin's court in Damascus, with its scholars and jurists, reflected an effort to present a cultured, legitimate rule that married Islamic law with the necessities of governance. Patronage of madrasas and scholars was not mere ostentation, it was investment in a system of knowledge that reinforced his rule with religious legitimacy. Upholding law and scholarship helped tie the fractured territories together under a common intellectual and moral framework. The personal qualities attributed to Saladin, piety, humility, a love of justice, served as much political purpose as moral description. A ruler who could be seen praying humbly in the mosque, helping the needy, or publicly shunning excess gained an aura that made rebellion less attractive to subjects and more embarrassing to rivals. His public persona was an instrument of statecraft as much as it was an expression of character. The reality of Saladin's household, however, also contained the trappings of power, gilded objects, retainers, camels, and horses that required feeding and the management of vast holdings. Wealth had to be marshaled and displayed, yet Saladin's reputation for relative austerity reinforced the idea that his wealth served the state and not merely personal indulgence. The careful balance between splendor and restraint communicated authority without alienating the populace. Stories of encounters between Saladin and the Christian kings retain a theatrical quality because they encapsulate both conflict and mutual recognition. The image of Richard and Saladin respecting one another's valor has been repeated in literature and art for centuries, even as both men remained uncompromising on core goals. Such mutual admiration does not erase the suffering or the political stakes, but it humanizes the actors in a conflict often written as rigid blocks. The aftermath of Saladin's death saw his empire divided among his sons and relatives, and the Ayyubid dynasty would lose and regain bits of territory over ensuing generations. The political unity forged under his command did not survive intact. Regionalism, tribal loyalties, and the ambitions of emirs slowly carved out partitions. Yet the structures he left behind and the precedent of unified resistance against foreign intrusion endured in memory and practice. In the centuries after his life, Saladin's figure became a symbol in a variety of political narratives. Ottoman sultans, Arab reformers, European romantics, and modern nationalists each laid claim to him in differing ways. He was a hero of Islamic resistance, a paragon of chivalry, an Islamic king with codes that could be held alongside European knighthood. His life served as a lens through which later societies projected their aspirations and anxieties. Modern historians continue to debate the balance between Saladin the man and Saladin the symbol. Was he primarily a pious crusader for Islam or a savvy medieval state builder making pragmatic choices? The answer is both. Historical actors rarely fit into neat categories, and Saladin's actions must be read in their complexity. He was guided by faith and by ambition, by mercy and by calculation, often simultaneously. Even in popular culture, Saladin appears with different hues. He features in novels, films, and operas, sometimes as a sympathetic nobleman, sometimes as a cunning adversary. Each retelling picks out traits that resonate with contemporary audiences: generosity, leadership, strategic genius. These portrayals shape the modern imagination of the medieval world and often blend fact with invention to make dramatic points. It is instructive to consider the voices of those who lived under his rule: merchants whose caravans reached safer harbors because of his control, peasants who tilled fields with less fear of raiding parties, and clerics who adjusted to new jurisprudential norms. Their lives were not singularly defined by battle but by the day-to-day realities of governance, taxation, and security. Saladin's policies touched these worlds in ways that outlasted any single campaign. The art of siegecraft during Saladin's time combined brute force and subtlety. Catapults and trebuchets hurled stones while miners undermined walls, and engineers devised countermeasures to resist assaults. Fortresses were not mere stone but built symbols of political will, and their capture or defense could hinge on small, technical details: the angle of an incline, the cohesion of a garrison, the supply of water. Saladin's understanding of such technicalities grew from experience. His campaigns in Egypt taught him the value of logistics and fortification as much as battlefield prowess. He invested in arms and in men skilled at the support tasks that campaigns required. That investment in the mundane but vital parts of war made his forces more resilient when facing European armies that sometimes relied excessively on individual feats of arms. The crusading movement had internal tensions too: disputes over command, competing goals between kings and the papacy, and the simple difficulty of maintaining a multinational force far from home. These fissures helped Saladin by preventing his enemies from presenting a unified front. Political infighting in Europe often translated into missed opportunities for the Crusaders, while Saladin's steadier chain of command allowed him to capitalize on mistakes. Religious tolerance under Saladin was pragmatic. While Islam was the framework of governance, he allowed for the protection of Christians and Jews within his territories so long as they accepted the authority of his administration. Religious minorities paid jizya and were subject to certain restrictions, yet they often maintained their communities and places of worship. This arrangement enabled multi-religious cities to continue as centers of trade and learning. The economic consequences of Saladin's campaigns deserve attention. Warfare disrupted trade for a time, but his control over ports and roads eventually restored commerce to a degree. Markets re-emerged, and trade across the Mediterranean adapted. Merchants found ways to ply old routes and to form new partnerships. In the long run, the Levant remained a fulcrum of Eurasian exchange, albeit under different political colors. Scholars of military history note that Saladin's army drew on diverse ethnic and social components: Kurdish cavalry, Arab infantry, Turkish horsemen, and North African contingents. That diversity could be a strength when managed well, but it also required skill to keep loyalties aligned. Saladin's recruitment and distribution of spoils, appointments to office, and distribution of land all aimed to stabilize this heterogeneity into an effective fighting force. The supply of horses, a central concern in medieval warfare, shaped many decisions. A mounted army required pastures, fodder, and veterinary care. Without these things, cavalry lost its edge. Saladin ensured that supply networks were in place and that allies provided what was needed. When campaigns stretched far from home, these logistical threads frayed, reminding commanders that victory often hinged on unseen labor as much as on frontline valor. The rhetoric of holy war colored the language of both sides, yet it also served political ends. Popes used the idea of crusade to summon knights and to strengthen their own authority over Christendom, while Muslim preachers invoked jihad to mobilize defenders. Both concepts were flexible, used to rally people but also to justify pragmatic political choices. The invocation of sanctity, then, was as much a tool as a belief. Our story also touches on individual acts that illuminate the human cost of war: a mother pleading for the ransom of her son, a small town burned to deny its usefulness to an enemy, a pilgrim walking into a holy city uncertain of what the new authorities will mean for his prayers. These intimate moments, multiplied across decades, created the social fabric of an age. Saladin's decisions touched such lives and therefore carried moral weight beyond strategy. Memory and commemoration play their roles in how Saladin is understood. Monuments, inscriptions, and later histories all sought to fix his name in time. Yet memory is selective. Generations choose which parts of a past to honor and which to downplay. Saladin's reputation as magnanimous suited many later narratives, but contemporaries often had more ambivalent things to say. Even his enemies could not help but respect him, and that respect helped shape a peculiar kind of cross-cultural dialogue. Knights wrote about his methods, clerics discussed his virtues, and merchants accounted for his policies in their ledgers. To the extent that bodies of knowledge circulated between cultures, Saladin's era was formative in creating channels of interaction amid conflict. There are also stories of near misses and narrowly avoided catastrophes, sieges lifted on the eve of surrender, messages intercepted and misread, deals struck that a single messenger could have reversed. History is full of such hinge moments, and Saladin's career featured many instances where luck and timing mattered as much as skill. His ability to seize opportunities reveals a pragmatic opportunism that is central to how he achieved success. The lasting architectural legacy of the Ayyubid era includes fortifications and religious buildings that testify to the priorities of the rulers. Some structures were meant to awe, others to serve practical needs such as hospitals and madrasas. Saladin's patronage of public works helped consolidate his legacy as a builder as well as a warrior, and these physical traces provide tangible connections to a time often rendered only in words. One should not overlook the role of communication networks, couriers, envoys, and the intricate web of letters that kept disparate territories coordinated. Information traveling fast and reliable made centralized control possible. Slow or disrupted communication could doom an operation. Saladin's administration invested in such networks, ensuring that orders from Damascus reached the edge of his domains when needed. Even the weather played a role in shaping campaigns. Rains could turn a road into a quagmire, drought could sap the strength of horses and men, and seasonal patterns dictated when armies could move. Commanders like Saladin developed a practical sense of climate and seasons, timing maneuvers to fit the rhythms of the land. That ecological awareness was as much military wisdom as any tactical manual. The end of Saladin's life saw him surrounded by advisors and relatives, grappling with illness and the inevitability of succession. He took measures to secure his legacy, but the diffuse nature of power in the medieval Islamic world made absolute continuity difficult. His empire, like many of his era, relied on personal ties and loyalty that could fray after his death, yet the stories he inspired would remain resilient. In the centuries that followed, Saladin's image was used by rulers and thinkers to make points about virtue, legitimacy, and resistance. Sometimes his life answered questions of the present, offering a model for rulers who sought to unify or to resist foreign intrusion. His story proved adaptable, sliding into new narratives as cultures and polities changed. To listen to his life is to hear the clash of steel and the whisper of trees, to sense the heat of a noon sun over a battlefield and the hush of a mosque at prayer. It is to understand that medieval history was lived by people who loved, feared, negotiated, and fought with the same messy motives that haunt human affairs today. Saladin stands in that human panorama, neither saint nor icon alone, but a man whose decisions had earth-shaking consequences. As we reflect on the tale of Saladin versus the crusading kings, we must resist the temptation to flatten his story into heroes and villains. The reality is a woven cloth of motives, circumstances, and personalities. Both sides were fiercely loyal to their causes, yet both also displayed moments of pragmatism and conciliation that complicate any simple moralizing. In our age, when conflicts are often framed in stark oppositions, Saladin's life offers a reminder of nuance. His mixture of piety and politics, of mercy and ruthlessness, shows how leaders balance ideals against the practicalities of power. Understanding that balance helps us see the medieval world not as an alien landscape but as a continuum of human strategies for survival and dominance. There is also a lesson in the limits of conquest. Saladin achieved remarkable victories, but his inability to create an enduring centralized state teaches that personal genius alone rarely crafts lasting institutions. Durable polities depend on administrative depth, cultural integration, and economic sustainability, not merely on battlefield brilliance. His story thus becomes a meditation on what kinds of power endure and which fade with a generation. Finally, Saladin's memory endures because it answers a human need for stories that blend courage with compassion. He becomes an emblem for those who long to imagine a noble opposition, fierce in defense, reasonable in governance, generous in victory. Whether the stories are true in every detail matters less than the way they shape the collective imagination of generations who sought exemplars in turbulent times. Listening to this life, we are carried along fields of combat, into candlelit councils, through market squares echoing with many languages, and into the quiet of prayer rooms where men and women wondered about their fate. The narrative is long because the stakes were high and the consequences far-reaching, because the lives touched by these events multiplied across centuries. Saladin's conflict with the kings of the cross remains a crucible for reflection on leadership, faith, and the human cost of contested holy ground. The story begins before Jerusalem ever felt the weight of siege engines and banners, in the long, grinding decade when two great worlds pressed against each other like tectonic plates. On one side were men who called themselves defenders of the cross, hardened by pilgrimage and crusade, carrying faith like armor. On the other stood a rising power in the Muslim world, a sultan who would become a legend, a man named Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom history remembers as Saladin. Saladin did not appear as a storm overnight. He was forged in the politics and warfare of Syria and Egypt, a leader who stitched alliances, quelled rebellions, and moved with the deliberation of a commander who knew the cost of every life he asked of his soldiers. His reputation for both ruthlessness and restraint grew together, and by the summer of 1187 he had the momentum of his victories behind him and the eyes of two faiths upon him. The city itself, Jerusalem, was more than stone and alley. It was a hinge in the imagination of Christians and Muslims, a city of pilgrimage, of relics and prophets, of shrines that drew pilgrims like bees to honey. For its defenders, Jerusalem embodied sacred obligation. For Saladin, it was both a strategic jewel and a spiritual challenge. That complexity set the stage for a siege that would be measured not only in minutes and walls but in honor, blood, and mercy. The lead-up to the siege was a campaign strewn with decisive moments, the most famous of which was the battle on the Horns of Hattin in July of 1187. The Christian army, hampered by thirst and confusion, was surrounded and shattered. It was there that the true fate of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was sealed, its leadership captured or killed, its knights defeated, and its sense of invincibility shattered like pottery thrown against a rock. From Hattin, Saladin moved with intent. He did not immediately march on Jerusalem as a mindless conqueror. He consolidated, he secured supply lines, and he allowed his forces to recover and prepare. There was a calculated rhythm to his campaign, an understanding that taking a city like Jerusalem required more than force. It required a narrative that would hold after the banners were raised. When Saladin's forces finally approached Jerusalem, the city's defenders felt the slow tightening of a noose. The garrison was diminished, the morale fraying, and the Christian population anxious. News spread like a cold draft through narrow streets. The Sultan was at the gates, and the fate of the holy city hung in the balance. That anxiety shaped the tone of the negotiations and the actions that followed. Sieges in the medieval world were crude and intimate at once. They were machines of attrition, engines designed to exhaust a city's food, its patience, and its will. Siege engines thundered, towers rose, and engineers scouted the walls. But sieges were also human dramas. Civilians huddled in basements, mothers whispered prayers, and the wounded were carried past gatehouses where soldiers argued over the proper code of conduct. Jerusalem's walls were ancient and irregular, patched and repatched over centuries by builders whose names were lost to time. The Christian defenders had a limited supply of men and little room for error. They moved archers to the towers, rationed bread, and prayed for relief that did not come. Outside, Saladin watched and waited, probing points of strength and weakness, and calculating which blows would fracture resolve and which would merely harden it. It would be a mistake to imagine Saladin only as a cold strategist. He was also a man who believed in religious legitimacy and personal honor. That belief shaped his decisions during the siege. At the same time, he was a commander whose orders were interpreted by captains, soldiers, and clerks, each adding their own human element, sometimes merciful, sometimes cruel, in the froth of war. The confrontation between Saladin and Jerusalem was not simply one of arms, it was a negotiation in the broadest sense. The terms of surrender were debated like treaties, with emissaries crossing between camp and gate under flags of truce. These conversations were filled with the music of words, offers, refusals, pleas, and reminders of past oaths. Each phrase carried weight, for words in such moments could be an extension of the sword. Accounts diverge on small details, as is the way with memory and chroniclers, but a shared outline emerges. Over the course of weeks, negotiations yielded a pact, surrender would be considered, and the lives of many could be spared for a price. The city could avoid a slaughter if its inhabitants could meet the conditions, a solution that was both pragmatic and morally fraught. Here the themes of honor and mercy began to entwine like two lines of a braid. To understand the moral texture of those decisions, imagine the city breathing under siege. The air would have smelled of smoke, pressed bread, and sweat. The sun struck the stones with sharp light that made the colors of banners vivid and cruel. Inside, people bartered their possessions. Outside, soldiers measured out rations and polished their weapons. This was a theater where the most private fears were played out in public. Saladin's men were not a homogeneous mass. They came from far-flung regions, Kurds, Turks, Arabs, Berbers, united by command but varied in motivation. Some sought plunder, some glory, some faith. Their leaders, too, were men of character and contradiction, charged with both enforcing discipline and satisfying the appetites of a hungry army. The Sultan's authority was significant, but not absolute. The same orders could be interpreted differently when the heat of victory rose. How, then, did mercy operate in such an environment? It came as an explicit policy and as a set of choices. Saladin had reasons, political, religious, and personal, for clemency. Allowing the Christian populace to leave or to ransom themselves preserved his image both at home and in the wider Islamic world. It also prevented the kind of mindless massacre that could inflame resistance elsewhere. Yet mercy, as always, had limits defined by resources, control, and the strategic calculus of authority. On the Christian side, honor played out through the Latin nobles and clerics who debated whether to fight to the death or to accept terms that would spare civilians. For knights raised on a code that valued bravery and resistance, surrender was a bitter medicine. For clerics, the duty to protect souls and relics complicated matters further. They argued not only for military strategy but for the sanctity of places and the fate of the faithful. The spectacle of banners lowered and leaders parleying at the gates had a ritual quality. Envoys exchanged messages wrapped in silk and sealed with rings. Saladin, ever mindful of symbolism, received envoys with a mixture of dignity and stoic command. He projected an image of restraint that many chroniclers emphasized, an image that would crystallize into legend, a conqueror who could be merciful, a victor who could temper triumph with generosity. The actual surrender of Jerusalem carried both legalism and humanity. Terms were laid down, citizens who could pay would be allowed to depart, churches might be preserved for Christian worship, certain defenders could be ransomed. Those unable to pay faced harsher fates, including enslavement. Historical sources differ on numbers, but the human reality was clear. Some paid and walked free, others became captives, and later bargains involved the exchange of coin and human dignity in ways that hurt to recount. A vivid anecdote often told is of the scene at the gate when Saladin asked for a piece of the true cross or the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He did not plunder relics for the sake of blasphemy, rather, he sought to prevent their desecration and to assert symbolic control. In granting terms that allowed Christian worship in some places, he functioned as both conqueror and custodian, an uneasy but pragmatic combination. There was blood in Jerusalem, as there must be in any transfer of power in wartime, but the slaughter was not on the scale of some other medieval sackings. That fact speaks to the order Saladin imposed, to his interest in reputation, and to the practical advantages of avoiding needless devastation. Still, blood touched many, knights who had stood long and proud, civilians who could not pay, and those trapped by circumstance. Mercy and brutality often braided together in ways that made the judgment of any single actor ambiguous. Witnesses afterward recounted scenes that mixed compassion and hardship. Chroniclers sympathetic to Saladin highlighted his clemency, his orders to prevent mass murder, and his occasional acts of generosity, such as paying ransom for prisoners who could not afford it. Christian sources, understandably aggrieved, documented the hardships endured by the populace, the separations of families, and the indignities of enslavement. Both sets of accounts illuminate different angles of a complex event. To the men who marched in his banners, Saladin sometimes gave personal orders that defined the tone. He forbade unnecessary plunder in some instances, punished looters in others, and ensured that certain holy places were not vandalized. These were not empty proclamations, they were enforced with penalties and the social pressure of honor. That was not to say every soldier obeyed, but the Sultan's voice carried weight and consequence in the field. Beyond the immediate mechanics of surrender and ransom were the quieter acts that shaped human memory. There were instances of individual mercy that read like small miracles, a captain paying a family's ransom out of his own coin, a cleric allowed to lead the last procession through a chapel, a young soldier sparing an enemy's life for reasons of pity. These acts did more for the story that would be told than any decree could, because they humanized the encounter and gave it the texture of moral choice. The exchanges of prisoners and the negotiation of ransom were themselves scenes of intense human drama. Families negotiated with emissaries, counting the coins they did not have, bargaining with their dignity. Saladin's agents sometimes accepted property, jewelry, or promises in lieu of cash, a pragmatic flexibility in a world where currency and lives were often indistinguishable. What to a modern mind looks brutal, the selling of people into slavery, was then a common, if painful, instrument of war that had rules and customs around it. What makes the siege of Jerusalem so striking for listeners today is the way honor and mercy were constantly interpreted through the lens of religion. Saladin was a devout Muslim who framed his campaign in terms of jihad and restoration, but he also understood the power of magnanimity. For him, mercy was not solely a Christian virtue to be copied, it was an Islamic one, expressed through the concept of clemency and proper conduct toward prisoners. He wanted to be seen as a just victor, not as a barbarian. There were also moments of theatricality, deliberate gestures meant to send messages across faith lines. Saladin once allowed Christian pilgrims to enter Jerusalem peacefully, a move that suggested he could be both conqueror and protector of pilgrims' rights. Such gestures were public relations as much as piety, meant to reassure both his subjects and the wider world that his victory would not mean wholesale desecration. Inside Jerusalem, the psychological effect was profound. The city's residents had to imagine their lives without the familiar structures that had governed them, the Latin lords who had been the city's scaffolding for generations, the market rhythms disrupted by occupation, the clergy who had guided spiritual life in a suddenly changed political landscape. People made private calculations about what to take, what to leave, and how to arrange their affairs when the city's legal order slipped into uncertainty. Daily life under surrender was a balancing act. Markets reopened slowly as people negotiated safe conduct, religious services resumed where permitted, and new officials were installed to manage the city's affairs under the Sultan's oversight. The weight of history and the hum of ordinary business lived side by side. A woman might bargain for grain one moment and pray at a shrine the next. That ordinary texture reminds us that war penetrates the most mundane corners of life. Saladin's personal conduct in Jerusalem fed legends that outlived him. Stories circulated that he refused to enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because he would not step over Christian priests, or that he placed a gift on an altar. Some of these tales are likely embroidered, others may be partially true. What matters is how these stories shaped a moral narrative, a victor who respected the sanctity of the defeated people's faith, at least in form and at certain moments. At the same time, there were pressures that shaped harder decisions. The Sultan had to manage his own army, prevent opportunistic looting, and preserve the loyalty of contingents who expected reward. He also needed to secure his conquests against counterattack and to use Jerusalem as a bargaining chip in wider diplomacy. Mercy had to be measured against the immediate needs of governance and military prudence. The presence of holy sites meant that every act could be read as theological. When Saladin decreed protections for certain churches, that decision resonated with clerics and pilgrims who feared the worst. When certain Christian captives were freed, there were prayers said and thanks. When people were enslaved, those very actions were often justified as the brutal arithmetic of war, but also contested by clergy and lay people who argued for different outcomes. Faith made every act both political and sacred. The population dynamics after surrender were fluid and tragic. Many families dispersed, some choosing exile over life under new rulers. Others stayed, choosing survival in a city that now had a different center of gravity. The demographic reshuffling altered the city's character in subtle and not so subtle ways. Languages mingled in the markets, legal practices shifted, and the cultural palette of the city acquired new hues. How did the European world react? News of Jerusalem's fall struck like thunder across Christendom. The loss prompted a scramble for reinforcements, vows, and eventual calls for a new crusade. Letters were sent to kings, appeals to popes were made, and a mood of crisis seized the Western courts. The siege thus had reverberations far beyond the city's walls, shaping decades of history and countless human destinies. In the Muslim world, Saladin's capture of Jerusalem elevated him to near-mythic status. He was praised as a unifier and defender of sacred places. Poets and chroniclers lauded his restraint and his warrior virtues, building an image that would be cemented in the annals of Islamic history. Yet that image was also the product of political need. Leaders often cultivate narratives that bind people together, and Saladin was no exception. The idea of honor here is complicated. For Saladin, honor meant winning with restraint, maintaining legitimacy, and upholding a concept of just conduct that would be remembered. For the defenders, honor could mean dying as a knight should, a prospect that appealed to martial identities. For common people, honor was often about survival with dignity, protecting families, preserving property, and ensuring the continuity of ritual life. Each group had its own moral grammar. There were smaller tableaus that revealed the texture of daily reality during and after the siege. Imagine a bread seller counting coins while soldiers argue about distribution, or a priest reading from a battered prayer book illuminated by a shaft of light in a ruined chapel. Such images allow us to move from grand strategies to the human scale, where decisions were lived rather than announced. The siege also highlighted the importance of law and custom in medieval warfare. There were rules about who could be ransomed, who could be enslaved, and which properties could be seized. These rules were imperfect and often violated, but they provided a framework that both sides invoked to justify actions. The invocation of law in such raw situations is a reminder that even in war people seek boundaries and norms. One cannot tell this story without acknowledging the economic dimensions. Cities like Jerusalem flourished on trade, pilgrimage, and agriculture. The disruption of a siege had enormous economic consequences: grain stores depleted, trade routes rerouted, and economic uncertainty frozen investment. The fiscal calculations of ransom and ransom payments therefore intermingled with strategic considerations, making the siege both a military and a commercial event. We should pause on the human cost in a way that resists abstraction. Children were orphaned, artisans lost their tools, and memories of violence were hard to forget. The material record, ruined houses, repurposed churches, artifacts dispersed, speaks to a cultural and personal cost that goes beyond numbers. War wrecks structures and identities, and the ending of one order often opens a long transition during which ordinary people find new ways to live. In the aftermath, rebuilding took many forms. Some churches were restored and reopened, others remained silent. New governance structures were established, local notables accommodated to the Sultan's appointees, and the integration of Jerusalem into Saladin's realms required legal and administrative work. That bureaucratic labor is often overlooked in narratives of heroism, but it is the slow work that gives shape to what once was a violent rupture. Religious rituals adapted to new circumstances. Muslim prayers were said in public with a sense of triumph and solemnity. Christians negotiated space for their rights, and in some cases continued to celebrate their holy days under new oversight. The coexistence that followed was uneven and punctuated by tension, but it was also a testament to human adaptability when institutions change. Saladin's decisions in Jerusalem fed into his broader reputation as a leader who balanced martial prowess with magnanimity. Yet historians remind us that his clemency was not a universal blanket but a pragmatic tool. He spared many, but not all. He honored places he viewed as sacred, but he also used force where he judged it necessary. This nuance resists simple moralization and invites a deeper look at leadership in crisis. Narratives written after the event are themselves acts of shaping memory. Muslim chroniclers emphasized the pious character and mercy of their leader, while Latin chroniclers recounted loss and suffering. Both sides shaped an interpretative frame for what had happened, and fusing it with lessons about divine favor, the consequences of pride, or the virtues of restraint. Over time, these stories braided into larger myths that fueled future actions and justified subsequent choices. The siege of Jerusalem also left imprints on law and diplomacy. The way ransom agreements were negotiated informed later practices, and the treatment of holy sites became a subject of diplomatic attention. The memory of the siege entered treaties and letters, shaping expectations about how conquerors should behave. In that sense, the event was not only a military turning point but a touchstone in the evolving rules of international conduct. Personal reputations were made and unmade. Saladin's name became synonymous with certain virtues, while the defenders' reputations were contested. Knights who survived retold tales of courage, while scholars and clerics debated the morality of decisions made under duress. Reputation mattered immensely in a world where honor could determine not only how history remembered you but how contemporaries treated you in life. A listener should imagine the city as a mosaic of human stories, some loud and public, others quiet and private. The proud gestures of banners and proclamations existed alongside the whispered bargains and basements. That coexistence of spectacle and intimacy is what gives the siege its emotional complexity. It was both a grand political event and an accumulation of private tragedies and mercies. There were also later acts of remembrance and contestation. Pilgrimage routes adjusted, and stories of Saladin's mercy were told to justify peaceful conduct. Memory is a political resource, and both sides used the siege as a source of identity. Monuments and chronicles crystallized those memories, ensuring that future generations would confront the past through the lens of earlier interpretations. Sometimes the small acts mattered more than the grand ones. A soldier refusing to loot a chapel, a scribe preserving a record, a merchant secretly sheltering a family, these acts of individual conscience and courage softened the edges of conquest. They remind us that even when history appears to be made by great men and brutal battles, individual decisions shape how the story feels to ordinary people. In the years after 1187, the memory of Jerusalem's fall haunted Europe and animated military responses. The Third Crusade followed, led by figures as famous as Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus, each motivated by a mixture of piety, politics, and personal ambition. The retaking of territories, the sieges and skirmishes that followed, were shaped by the precedent set at Jerusalem, a precedent that combined mercy and calculated severity. Saladin lived the remainder of his life under the weight of his achievements and the moral reputation that followed them. He remained a figure both praised for restraint and criticized by opponents for not doing more in some moments. Historians debate his motives, but few deny that his conduct in Jerusalem became a defining element of his legacy, shaping both Muslim and Christian imaginations for centuries. The story of the siege invites reflection on the nature of conquest itself. Is conquest defined by the banners raised at the gate or by the way the conquered are treated afterward? In Jerusalem, we see an answer complicated by faith, politics, and personal virtue. Saladin's actions suggest that conquest can be governed by codes of honor, but those codes operate in a world of imperfect human beings whose lives are bound up in the cruelty and compassion of the times. There are architectural echoes of those days that survive in the stonework and in the layout of the city. Layers of construction tell the story of occupations and restorations. Archaeology, when careful, can complement chroniclers by offering traces of daily life, hearths, coins, pottery. Such traces are the silent witnesses to the human flux that a siege creates. one can't help but consider the role of narrative in shaping moral lessons. Chroniclers on both sides crafted stories about Saladin's mercy to teach codes of conduct and about the defender's valor to inspire future generations. These stories tuned moral imagination in the years to come, persuading people that certain virtues led to divine favor or worldly success. Thus the siege became not only history but moral instruction. The very idea of mercy as part of conquest has philosophical weight. Saladin's clemency can be read as a form of enlightened self-interest, a policy that reduces long-term resistance and secures legitimacy. Yet it can also be read as an expression of genuine ethical commitments, for in his era leaders were judged by their honor and piety as much as their conquests. If mercy is pragmatic, it was also moral in a landscape where legitimacy came from conformity to religious and social norms. There were tragedies that mercy could not erase. The broken economic networks, the families that could not be reunited, and the psychological scars endured across generations, all of these remained long after banners were furled. Mercy can heal certain wounds, but not all. The narrative of Jerusalem is therefore partly about what mercy could not accomplish, and that failure is as significant as its successes. The siege also deepened existing cultural exchanges. For all the violence, there were moments of borrowing and adaptation, administrative techniques, military practices, and even culinary influences moved across boundaries. Conquest creates contact zones where knowledge and practices can travel, and Jerusalem, at the crossroads of faiths and empires, was fertile ground for such exchanges. As time moved on, poets and chroniclers continued to reshape the memory of the siege. Saladin's figure took on near-mythic proportions in some accounts, and the events of 1187 became a cycle in epic narratives. These retellings emphasized scenes that fit moral archetypes: mercy at the gates, pious restraint, noble surrender, or tragic loss. Each retelling tailored the narrative to the needs and sensibilities of its audience. The moral complexity of leadership is another theme stitched through the siege's story. Saladin's choices show how leaders manage moral imperatives and pragmatic demands at once. He had to present himself as devout, ensure his army's loyalty, maintain supply lines, and navigate the unpredictable human impulses of soldiers and captives. That mixture is what makes his leadership subject to admiration and critique. Jerusalem's fall reshaped spiritual life in both obvious and subtle ways. Pilgrims who once traveled freely now faced new political realities and sometimes found their devotional paths altered. Some shrines were protected, others neglected for years, and the pilgrimage economy was reshuffled. The city's spiritual geography changed as much as its political map. Stories of personal encounter pepper the historical accounts and make the siege vivid. A merchant bartering with a besieging soldier, a priest negotiating the surrender of a relic, a woman hiding a child in a cellar, these human scenes convey the small-scale drama that makes a siege real. They are the threads that sew together the broader canvas of war and politics. Consider the ways in which the memory of Jerusalem became a rhetorical tool. European leaders used the fall as a call to arms. Islamic leaders used Saladin's victory to promote unity and piety. Memory became policy, and policy was justified by invoking the sanctity of what was lost or the justice of what had been regained. The siege thus functioned as a moral ledger that could be called upon for political ends. The question of what constitutes honorable conduct in war also resonates in the siege's story. Knights and sultans both appealed to codes, chivalric or Islamic, that framed their actions as honorable. But those codes could conflict when faith, survival, and political expediency collided. The Siege of Jerusalem provides a vivid case study in how ethical systems are applied under pressure, with inconsistent and human results. One cannot avoid the sensory tang of the historical scene when imagining the siege. The screech of siege engines, the clatter of hooves on stone, the aroma of roasted grain and the acrid smell of smoke, the sight of banners catching the sunlight like living scripture. All of these sensory elements animate the event. Such images are what make the past immediate to a listener, converting abstract policy into lived experience. Saladin's personal story continued beyond Jerusalem, but that city remained central to his legend. He died in 1193, leaving an empire that would not long survive him in its united form, but his name endured. Subsequent generations debated his acts, celebrated his virtues, and used his image for political purposes. The siege thus became part of a larger narrative about the rise and fall of empires and the moral contours of leadership. In the aftermath of battle and surrender, communities rebuild narratives to make sense of trauma. Christians and Muslims alike created stories that accounted for loss and salvation. Those narratives functioned as coping mechanisms and as tools for political mobilization, helping communities to process the upheaval and to articulate lessons for the future. A modern listener might be struck by the recurring theme of restraint amidst violence. Saladin's combination of force and clemency offers a lesson that resonates beyond its time, that power can be wielded with a view toward future stability rather than immediate gratification. Yet it is also a story of limits, for even the most merciful policies cannot eliminate the horrors of war. The legal and ethical frameworks that governed ransom and surrender after the siege also had a long life. Later rulers and military leaders would cite the conduct at Jerusalem as precedent, both as a model to emulate and as a cautionary tale. The practical lessons, how to prevent looting, how to handle captives, and how to secure holy sites, continue to inform leaders who faced similar dilemmas. Even as the centuries passed, the siege of Jerusalem was retold with shifting emphasis. In some eras it was a cautionary tale about the perils of disunity, in others a hymn to the virtues of a singular leader. The malleability of the story is itself a lesson about how history is never a static record but a living conversation between past and present. We should not romanticize the siege into a neat moral parable. It was messy, contingent, often brutal, and historically specific. Yet within that messiness are clarifying moments of human choice, decisions to show mercy or to exact vengeance, that illuminate what it means to be a leader and what it means to be human in crisis. Those moments offer a kind of moral clarity in a world defined by ambiguity. As listeners, we might find something of ourselves in the choices made during and after Jerusalem's surrender. We, too, negotiate between principle and necessity, between compassion and self-preservation. The siege, then, becomes not simply a distant historical event but a mirror in which we see how people act when structures break down and moral decisions must be made quickly. There is also the humility of scale to consider. Empires rise and fall, but ordinary people's lives often pivot in small, enduring ways. The child saved by a ransom, the craftsman who rebuilds a shop, the family that chooses exile, these are the lives that endure beyond banners and treaties. The siege of Jerusalem is a reminder that history's grand narratives are ultimately composed of countless private reckonings. Finally, the tale of honor, blood, and mercy at Jerusalem invites us to reflect on the lasting consequences of conflict. Mercy can mitigate horror but not erase the damage, honor can guide choices but not guarantee outcomes. The story resists simple moral satisfaction, instead offering a complex portrait of human behavior under the most trying conditions. It leaves us with images of a city transformed, of people striving to survive with dignity, and of a leader whose name would be carved into history in both glory and controversy. In the dim light of dawn, when the Levant still breathed the cool hush of morning, a boy learned to tie his turban and listen to the calls of a world that was changing. He was born into a fractured era of shifting loyalties, where rivers and roads marked lines of power as clearly as any border. From those early years, patience became a skill and observation a habit, for the landscape he knew would demand both in the years ahead. The man who rose from that boyhood would come to be called by many names, but most of all he would be remembered as the Lion of Faith. The story of his rise begins not with a single dramatic moment, but with a steady accumulation of choices, alliances, and refusals to accept what was. He belonged to a Kurdish family that had migrated through the corridors of the Middle East, finding a place within the courts and camps of rulers who valued loyalty and military skill. Being Kurdish did not mark him as an outsider in the way modern categories might demand. Rather, it placed him within a rich mosaic of peoples whose identities were as fluid as the caravans that crisscrossed the deserts. The young man learned to move between cultures with the same ease he showed on the saddle, absorbing language, law, and the practical arts of governance. Serving under patrons who sought to hold together territories after the disintegration of larger empires taught him the inconvenient truth that rulership is more often a matter of careful management than of dramatic conquest. He first came to prominence in the courts of his uncle and then in the service of Nur ad-Din, a ruler who embodied the same pragmatic mix of piety and politics that would shape his protege. Observing Nur ad-Din's methods, his emphasis on legitimacy through religious authority, his cautious diplomacy, and his readiness to strengthen institutions, left an imprint on the young leader. From these lessons he crafted a vision in which faith and statecraft would not oppose each other but would be tools to reinforce mutual authority. Egypt entered his life as both a challenge and an opportunity, a land that had long been a prize for those who could master its canals and its politics. At the time, Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid dynasty, a regime that had grown weak and inward-looking, its structures creaking under factionalism and neglect. To govern Egypt was to master grain, tax, and the delicate negotiations of urban elites, military commanders, and religious figures. He saw in Cairo a chance not merely to win a throne but to create an administrative base from which to support the wider project of resisting foreign incursion. His conquest of Egypt did not happen overnight. It was the result of incremental steps, each taken with an eye toward longer-term stability rather than short-lived triumph. He entered a city where different communities coexisted uneasily, and he moved carefully to establish legitimacy by restoring order and reconfiguring existing institutions rather than destroying them. He took pains to respect local customs when it suited the public good, and he was ruthless where he believed ruthlessness would prevent worse disorder. This combination of respect and ruthlessness would become a hallmark of his approach. Once Egypt was under his control, he used its financial and logistical resources to project power across Syria and into the Crusader states. The productions of the Nile allowed him to feed soldiers and to finance a standing force, and the ports gave him access to maritime supplies and trade. From this secure base he could contemplate not only defensive measures but the possibility of reclaiming cities that had fallen to foreign hands. Yet even in such planning, his attentions remained pragmatic. He understood that ruling what you already hold is as important as seizing what you do not. Then came the campaigns that would define his reputation across the medieval world, culminating in the struggle for Jerusalem. The city itself was a jewel whose symbolic weight exceeded its immediate material value, a place charged with spiritual meaning for Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. To win Jerusalem required not only military skill but also an appreciation of how acts of conquest would echo through the narratives of rival societies. He grasped that this was not merely a siege or a battle, it was an act whose consequences would be argued about for centuries. His military acumen became most visible at Hattin, a field in 1187 where careful strategy and an understanding of landscape combined to decisive effect. He used the geography, the drought, and the logistical weaknesses of his enemies to shape the battle rather than trying to outmatch them in brute force alone. The victory at Hattin dismantled the military backbone of the Crusader states and opened the path to Jerusalem. Yet even in triumph he displayed an unusual moderation, and his subsequent handling of the conquered cities underscored a pragmatic streak that valued order and reconciliation over unrestrained vengeance. When Jerusalem itself surrendered, the terms he offered were shaped by a calculated blend of pragmatism and magnanimity. He allowed for ransom and safe passage where possible, and he forbade wanton slaughter, a stance that shocked some contemporaries and delighted others. That magnanimity was not mere sentiment, it was a deliberate policy meant to stabilize regions riven by conflict and to position himself as a ruler whose word could be trusted. His conduct in victory deepened his reputation not only among his followers but also among his adversaries, who were forced to reassess the nature of the conflict they faced. The way he treated prisoners and enemies became a frequent subject of chroniclers on both sides of the conflict, who sometimes admired and sometimes disparaged his choices. Stories circulated of him refusing to break his word even when it might have seemed wise to do so, signing documents that guaranteed safety and then ensuring those guarantees were honored. He understood that reputation was a currency in war, as valuable as any sword, and he spent considerable political capital to build a name associated with justice as much as with strength. This trustworthiness would complicate future diplomacy and shape the ways in which his memory was recounted. Beyond the battlefield, his governance reflected an administrative mind attuned to the needs of diverse populations, concentrating on law, fiscal reform, and the re-establishment of civic services. He sought to maintain the irrigation systems that sustained agriculture and to ensure markets functioned so taxes could be collected without provoking unrest. He re-established police and judicial institutions so that trade could resume more or less normally, and he worked to incorporate local elites into new frameworks of loyalty instead of purging them wholesale. These efforts often went unnoticed in grand narratives of wars and sieges, but for the people living in those cities, they mattered every day. His identity as both a warrior and a patron of learning created a unique tension, one he negotiated with deliberate care. He supported scholars, endowed madrasas, and maintained correspondence with leading religious and intellectual figures of his day, projecting an image of piety that bolstered his political legitimacy. Yet he also expected clear utility from public works and scholarly institutions. They were instruments to cultivate loyalty, to produce administrators, and to fuse religious authority with political governance. This was not hypocrisy but rather a coherent strategy in which the cultivation of knowledge served statecraft and vice versa. Family life and intimate relationships have a way of shaping even the sternest of rulers, and his was no exception. He was a man surrounded by relatives and depended upon a network of lieutenants whose loyalties were sometimes more personal than legal. He balanced these bonds carefully, promoting those who were capable while making room for a degree of patronage that kept influential clans invested in the state's success. Yet he was not merely a nepotist, he rose through merit and demanded competence from those who served him. This blend of merit and kinship mirrored the political culture of the time, which relied on personal bonds as much as on institutional authority. He was also a patron of architecture and urban renewal, recognizing that the built environment communicates power even when words fail. Fortresses were repaired, mosques renovated, and markets rehabilitated under his watch in ways that signaled stability. The architectural projects he sponsored were visible reminders that an era of uncertainty had ended and that a new order, with its own aesthetics and priorities, had arrived. These projects also served a symbolic function. They demonstrated an ability to protect sacred spaces and to sustain civic life. His reputation for generosity became a recurring motif in the tales told about him, often framed in almost mythic terms. Tales of lavish banquets, of ransoms paid to reunite families, of food distributed to the poor, circulated widely and were amplified by chroniclers who sought examples of noble behavior. While some stories were no doubt exaggerated, they rested on a kernel of truth about his inclination to use wealth as a tool of public policy rather than as mere personal indulgence. Generosity, in his hands, functioned as a political instrument as much as a virtue. Religion, for him, was at once a personal conviction and a public language of legitimacy. He sought to knit his political program into the larger tapestry of Sunni Islam in order to present his rule as not merely effective but divinely approved. He supported scholars who could legitimize his actions, and he aligned himself with institutions whose authority extended beyond any single court. To his contemporaries, his piety was convincing, not because it was performed for the sake of appearances, but because it expressed an ethic that shaped many of his policy choices. The story of his diplomacy is as revealing as his battles. He negotiated with Latin rulers, employed envoys who spoke several languages, and used marriage, gifts, and promises to forge temporary peace where permanent treaties were impossible. Diplomacy for him was not a retreat from conflict, but another field of battle, one less noisy but equally consequential. The letters and envoys that passed back and forth between his courts and those of the Crusaders carried as much meaning as any sword stroke, shifting perceptions in capitals far removed from the front lines. Even when he negotiated, he never ceded the symbolic advantage of religious legitimacy. He demanded recognition that his victories were in service of a broader religious cause, and he refused to be sidelined into the role of mere regional potentate. In doing so, he created a narrative in which his political success and religious aspiration bolstered each other. Historians would later argue about how much of his piety came from faith and how much from political calculation, but the two are not easily separated in a world where faith was a primary currency of authority. Military innovation marked his campaigns, although he was rarely an innovator for innovation's sake. He emphasized mobility, intelligence gathering, and the judicious use of cavalry, and he relied on a diverse array of forces that included professional soldiers, local levies, and mercenaries. His logistics were often superior because he understood the simple fact that wars are often won by those who can feed their forces and keep them supplied. He employed engineers to manage sieges, but he also respected the limits of technology and recognized the psychological dimensions of warfare, rumor, morale, and reputation. His commanders were not anonymous subordinates. He cultivated a cadre of lieutenants whose own reputations became intertwined with his. These men were given responsibilities that required political as well as military acumen, and he judged them by their ability to hold ground and to integrate local elites into governance. Promotions were based on results and loyalty rather than on mere birthright, yet he balanced those promotions with appointments that satisfied kinship networks. The result was an officer class that felt both empowered and dependent, capable yet tied to the central authority. His personal demeanor surprised many who met him across cultural lines. Outsiders often expected hard cruelty from a warlord, but instead they encountered a man whose courtesy and humility disarmed some critics even as it unsettled others. His manners were not merely theatrical, they were rooted in a code of behavior that valued restraint, respect for piety, and a certain stoicism. When he spoke with foreign envoys, he cultivated a voice of reason rather than bombast, and that voice carried weight because it was backed by military accomplishment. Accounts of his sleep, his prayer discipline, his dietary habits, and his small acts of charity round out a portrait of a ruler whose public deeds were supported by private habits. He prayed at regular hours, fasted on occasion, and took time for counsel in a way that made his decisions appear measured. Yet he was also known for his simple tastes in clothing and household life, often preferring functionality over ornamentation. This personal simplicity translated into an image that made it harder for detractors to paint him as avaricious or decadent. Even his enemies sometimes acknowledged his sense of justice, an admission that speaks to a nuanced understanding of leadership that transcends rigid categories. Some Western chronicles grudgingly praised his chivalry, while some Eastern sources elevated his adherence to law and order. Such cross-cultural commendation is rare in histories of violent conflict, and it contributed significantly to the enduring myth that grew around him. A durable reputation amplifies itself, and his did exactly that as decades turned into centuries. The question of why his memory endures so vividly is as interesting as the facts of his life. His era was one in which narratives were shaped by religious meaning, and his deeds fit a pattern that appealed to both Muslim and non-Muslim audiences. He was a pious warrior who showed mercy and political skill. Memory is not simply the accumulation of facts, but the shaping of a story that resonates, and his story proved to be exceptionally resonant. Across cultures, people continue to retell the story of a leader who combined military success with moral rectitude. Stories, of course, change with retellings, and over time his life acquired layers of legend that mixed with historical fact. Some narratives emphasized his magnanimity and victory, others his strategic genius, and still others recast him as a symbol in tales that had little resemblance to the messy realities of medieval politics. Yet legends often contain truths that straightforward histories miss. They reveal what different communities valued and what they needed from the past. His legend, then, became a mirror in which successive generations saw traits they admired and desired. Poets and chroniclers amplified his deeds in ways that bound him to a moral exemplar rather than a mere temporal ruler. Verse and prose portrayed him as a paragon of virtue, a model for rulers and commoners alike. These literary embellishments were not merely flattery, they functioned as political tools, reinforcing ideals that his followers wished to replicate. Through literature, his image became portable, moving across regions and languages in a way that official decrees cannot. Within the regions he once governed, monuments and endowments kept his memory alive in concrete ways. Schools, mosques, and hospitals bearing his name became living reminders of his patronage and priorities. The built environment anchored memory in physical space, making it difficult for subsequent rulers to ignore the legacy he left. In times of crisis, people often invoked his name as a standard of righteous governance and sensible leadership. In Europe, his image took on a different tone as Western chroniclers and storytellers picked certain aspects of his life to fit their own frames of meaning. Some admired his chivalry, some feared his success, and some used him as a foil against which they defined their own ideals. Artistic depictions in European texts and later in paintings selectively borrowed elements of his character to serve local narratives. The exchange was not one way. Impressions of him also influenced how Muslim writers presented their own past. This cross-pollination of images enriched and complicated his place in history. Centuries later, in the modern era, political movements and national narratives across the Middle East found in his figure a symbol capable of uniting different claims about identity, sovereignty, and resistance. Whether invoked by reformers, nationalists, or religious leaders, his name carried a sense of legitimacy that transcended immediate political goals. Modern historians cautioned against simplistic appropriation of his image, but the allure of a historical hero who seemed to combine virtue and success was difficult to resist. He was easy to invoke because he provided a compact illustration of desirable leadership. Scholars in later centuries wrestled with the differences between the man and the myth, and that struggle itself is instructive about how historical memory is constructed. Primary sources from his time offered glimpses of daily life, administrative decrees, and military dispatches, while later chroniclers layered moral judgments onto those facts. The historian's task has been to separate as best they can the documentary residue from rhetorical flourish. And in doing so they uncovered a leader both more complicated and more human than the legend alone suggests. Careful study revealed contradictions instead of uniform magnanimity, and pragmatic necessity instead of uncluttered idealism. The material culture of his time, coins, seals, pottery, and architecture, also speaks to the ways in which he sought to project authority. Coins minted under his name circulated in markets, transmitting both economic value and symbolic recognition of sovereignty. Seals authenticated documents in ways that reduced personal arbitrariness and increased institutional reliability. Even the mundane artifacts of daily administration played a role in shaping the historical picture of a ruler who cared about systems as well as spectacle. These silent objects add texture to accounts dominated by speeches and battles. His illness and death, when they finally came, were treated with the same careful management that had characterized his life. He prepared instructions for the transition of power and sought to secure legacies that would outlast his person. Yet no amount of planning could entirely eliminate the uncertainties of succession in a medieval polity, and the years after his death were marked by struggles over inheritance and authority. Even the end of a great life showed how the structures he had built were vulnerable without continuous stewardship. The tomb where he was laid remains a site of memory and of contested interpretation, a place where history and reverence meet. For pilgrims, historians, and curious visitors, the tomb functions as a point of contact with a past that feels immediate despite the passage of centuries. The mausoleum, its inscriptions, and the rituals associated with it tell us as much about later generations as they do about him. They are evidence of how societies choose to remember and to honor those they deem exemplary. Across Islamic thought, he became a case study in virtuous rulership, pious enough to earn religious praise, effective enough to secure territory, generous enough to inspire loyalty. Religious scholars debated his actions in the context of jurisprudence and ethics, weighing the pragmatic against the ideal. Their discussions helped to enshrine certain norms about the treatment of prisoners, about warfare, and about public welfare, norms that would resonate in legal and moral thought for generations. The debates themselves testify to the moral seriousness with which his contemporaries and successors approached the problems of governance. He also became a figure in the collective imagination of Europe, influencing chivalric ideals and prompting reflections on the limits of crusading zeal. Western narratives often used his example to explore the question of how one should fight for God, especially when facing a foe who combined piety with political skill. Some European writers admired him precisely because he forced them to confront their own moral and strategic deficiencies. In this indirect way, his presence shaped the evolution of medieval European thought about war and virtue. Over time, artists and playwrights found in his life plentiful dramatic material, a charismatic leader confronting religious enemies, a ruler balancing mercy and ruthlessness, a man of faith and of arms. Such stories traveled beyond academic or religious circles into popular entertainment. The dramatized versions of his life sometimes simplified or exaggerated events for effect, but they kept his name alive among audiences who might never read a chronicle. Through theater, poetry, and later film, he entered the realm of enduring cultural shorthand for noble leadership. In the modern classroom, students encounter a figure who offers multiple angles for study: military historian, statesman, patron of learning, and moral exemplar. Each discipline emphasizes different aspects of his life, and together they provide a composite picture that resists neat conclusion. Understanding him requires not only a chronology of events, but also an appreciation of the social, economic, and religious fabrics of his age. A single sentence cannot contain him. He is a mosaic assembled from many fragments. Looking at his administrative reforms reveals a mind attentive to the mundane mechanisms of power. He standardized taxes in ways that improved predictability, and he delegated authority to local officials while maintaining central oversight. By doing so, he sought to make governance resilient to shocks and less dependent on the charisma of any single leader. These reforms were not glamorous, but they were crucial to creating durable institutions. It is in such technical work that the long-term effects of rulership are often decided. His coins remain artifacts that reveal the politics of identity and legitimacy. By minting currency that bore certain inscriptions and images, he broadcast a signal about who he was and who his subjects should recognize as sovereign. Currency travels through many hands, and with each transaction a subtle assertion of authority is made. The careful choice of phrases and epithets on coins was not mere vanity, it was a strategic act meant to shape perceptions across markets and courts. These small metal discs carried messages as loudly as any proclamation. The social policies he implemented reveal his sensitivity to the needs of diverse populations. He protected pilgrimage routes and made allowances for minority communities, understanding that social cohesion required practical concessions and symbolic gestures alike. Public order, to him, was not just a matter of force but also of legitimacy and trust. He sought to govern in ways that encouraged commerce, pilgrimage, and daily life to proceed without constant disruption. For common people, such stability mattered more than any distant treaty. His relations with scholars and jurists illuminate a leader comfortable with intellectual currents of his time. He sought counsel from learned men and often deferred to their opinions when those opinions aligned with public interest. At the same time, he was willing to override scholarly positions if he judged them impractical or dangerous for the polity. This dynamic between ruler and learned class produced debates that sharpened political theology and clarified the responsibilities of power. It also bolstered his image as a ruler engaged with moral considerations. Examining personal correspondence from his era reveals a man who used letters to shape diplomacy and to conduct delicate negotiations. Letters carried instructions, reassurances, and threats, and he wrote with a clarity that reflected a strategic mind. His dispatches were often measured, avoiding unnecessary provocation while still asserting his demands. In a world without instant communication, the careful construction of a letter could sway alliances and change the course of events. He mastered this art as surely as he mastered the battlefield. He also recognized the role that public ceremony and ritual play in maintaining political cohesion. Investitures, public prayers, and processions were orchestrated to convey an image of unity and divine favor. These ceremonies were not empty theater, they performed the social work of binding communities to a shared sense of purpose. He understood that people respond to spectacle as well as to policy, and he used ritual to reinforce his authority. Through these performances, the political order acquired moral texture. The administrative centers he established in cities like Cairo and Damascus became hubs of culture and learning, drawing scholars, artisans, and merchants. These cities flourished under policies that encouraged trade and tolerated diverse religious practices within certain limits. Urban vibrancy strengthened state revenue and made it easier to project power outward. In turn, a prosperous urban base supplied the manpower and material needed for sustained political projects. This cycle of development and security became a durable feature of his legacy. Stories of his personal generosity toward the poor and his attention to famine relief reveal priorities that went beyond mere image-making. He witnessed the real suffering that war inflicted and acted to mitigate it when possible, distributing grain, opening granaries, and ensuring that refugee populations received some measure of care. These acts were practical responses to crises, and they also reinforced a moral claim on the loyalty of common people. Charity, in his practice, functioned as both a political necessity and a moral imperative. His approach to taxation bore the imprint of an effort to balance state needs with popular tolerance. Tax rates were adjusted and sometimes temporarily suspended in times of hardship, showing a pragmatic willingness to sacrifice short-term revenue for longer-term stability. He recognized that harsh fiscal measures can sow resentment and lead to rebellion, so he sought a fiscal balance that would sustain governance without provoking unrest. This sensitivity to economic realities contributed to a more durable and accepted rule. The judicial reforms he supported aimed to make law more accessible and predictable, reducing the arbitrary exercise of power by local strongmen. He encouraged the training of judges and the establishment of clearer legal procedures, believing that an impartial sense of justice would legitimize his regime. These reforms reduced the space for corruption and helped integrate newly conquered areas into a single legal framework. Over time, they strengthened public confidence in institutions rather than in individuals alone. The military settlements he sponsored integrated veterans into settled life while also ensuring a pool of trained troops ready for mobilization. Veterans received land or stipends, which created vested interests in the stability of the state. This policy helped to professionalize the military and to reduce the unpredictability associated with mercenary forces. It also provided social outlets for those who had served, easing their return to civilian life. In this way, he intertwined military needs with social policy. His use of intelligence and reconnaissance set him apart from commanders who relied primarily on force of arms and brute courage. Scouts and informants were cultivated, and he took intelligence seriously as a way to avoid costly mistakes. The careful collection and analysis of information allowed him to seize opportunities and avoid traps, demonstrating a modern appreciation for knowledge as a strategic asset. He treated information as a weapon in its own right and invested in the systems that gathered it. Environmental factors, too, played a role in his campaigns. He understood the importance of water, forage, and climate in shaping the tempo of military operations. Campaign seasons were timed to take advantage of conditions that favored his forces and disadvantaged his enemies. Logistical planning included provisions for traversing arid regions, maintaining livestock, and sustaining long sieges. His attention to these seemingly mundane realities gave him an edge on the field of battle where others overlooked practical necessities. Religious minorities under his rule often experienced a complex mixture of protection and regulation, living under guarantees that allowed them to worship while also subjecting them to certain restrictions and taxes. This arrangement reflected a pragmatic approach to diversity, one that sought inclusion without dissolving identity boundaries. By offering protection in exchange for loyalty and fiscal contribution, he created a predictable relationship between ruler and religious minorities that facilitated commerce and social order. It was an arrangement that prioritized stability over homogeneity. His diplomatic practice included surprising acts of respect for the holy sites of other faiths, gestures that reinforced his image as a protector rather than a mere conqueror. He understood the symbolic power of sacred spaces and took steps to ensure that they were preserved and respected. These acts were politically shrewd, since demonstrating reverence for religious sites undercut accusations of wanton destruction and allowed him to present himself as a magnanimous victor. His policy toward sacred places complicated simplistic narratives of religious warfare. Even the languages spoken in his courts mattered. Multilingualism was an asset that allowed him to communicate with diverse subject populations and with foreign envoys. He surrounded himself with secretaries and translators who could craft messages in Arabic, Persian, and other tongues, enabling a diplomacy that crossed cultural boundaries. Language policy reinforced inclusivity and practical governance, allowing decrees and edicts to reach wider audiences. This linguistic flexibility was an everyday instrument of power. His patronage of the arts and of scholarship had lasting cultural consequences, as the institutions he supported continued to produce knowledge long after his death. Libraries collected texts, scholars debated jurisprudential questions, and students trained in new centers of learning carried knowledge into future generations. The intellectual life he fostered was both an expression of piety and a pragmatic investment in the human capital needed for governance. These cultural legacies contributed to the broader flourishing of the regions he once governed. Comparison with other historical figures reveals both common patterns and striking contrasts in how power is exercised. Like many successful rulers, he combined military skill with institutional building, yet his particular emphasis on moderation and reputation distinguished him from more brutal conquerors. His life invites reflection on the balance between force and persuasion, between coercion and consent. These comparisons help to situate him within a wider constellation of leaders who shaped medieval Eurasia. Saladin wasn't just strong, he was smart about how he used his power. Subscribe and let us know in the comments, do you think real leadership means doing what's right or doing what gets results?